In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a single glance at a garden fete sparks Miss Jane Marple's razor-sharp instincts. A nervous young woman, a stranger's cold stare, and a missing heirloom ignite a mystery that spirals into a web of deceit, blackmail, and betrayal. Who is pulling the strings? What secrets hide in the shadows of Ashby Manor? And can Miss Marple unravel the truth before the guilty slip away? Dive into a tale where one look unravels a conspiracy and no secret stays buried for long. Chapter 1. The glance in the Gardenthy sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, casting a golden haze across the vicarage garden, where the annual summer fete buzzed with the gentle hum of village life. Roses bobbed in the breeze, their petals catching the light, while the scent of freshly baked scones mingled with the laughter of children chasing a wayward kite. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly on a wicker chair near the tea tent, her knitting needles clicking softly, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles. To the casual observer, she was merely a frail spinster, absorbed in her wool and the pleasantries of the day. But to those who knew her truly knew her, she was a hawk in a cardigan, her mind as keen as the glint of sunlight on a blade. The fete was a grand affair, at least by St. Mary Mead's standards. The vicar, Mr. Clement, had outdone himself. This year, with a maypole for the children, a second-hand bookstall piled high with dog-eared novels, and a makeshift stage where the local choir warbled through green sleeves, villagers milled about, their voices weaving a tapestry of gossip and good-natured banter. Mrs. Price, the butcher's wife, was loudly proclaiming the superiority of her raspberry jam, while young Tommy Pierce darted between tables, pilfering an extra biscuit when he thought no one was watching. Miss Marple noticed. Of course she always did, but she let the boys scamper off with a faint smile. Some mischief was harmless, and her attention was elsewhere. It was then, as she reached for her teacup, that she caught it. Amid the swirl of pastel dresses and straw hats, a glance, not just any glance, but one that carried weight. Like a stone dropped into a still pond, it rippled through the air, fleeting but unmistakable, between two figures near the rose trellis. Clara Dunhill, a slight young woman with auburn curls and a nervous habit of twisting her gloves, stood frozen for a fraction of a second. Her eyes locked with those of a man Miss Marple didn't recognize. He was tall, with a sharp jaw and a coat too fine for a village fete, his expression unreadable before he turned away. Melting into the crowd, Clara's face flushed, her fingers tightening around her gloves until the leather creaked. Then, as if nothing had happened, she resumed her conversation with Mrs. Bantry, who was gesturing animatedly about the new peonies in her garden. Miss Marple's needles paused. She sipped her tea, the porcelain warm against her lips, and let her gaze drift as if admiring the roses. But her mind was already turning, sifting through the moment like a prospector panning for gold. That glance hadn't been casual. It wasn't flirtation, nor was it the easy familiarity of friends. It was something taut, secretive, laced with an emotion she couldn't yet name. Fear, perhaps, or guilt. She filed it away, her memory a neat cabinet of observations, each drawer labeled with the quirks and tells of human nature. Clara Dunhill was new to St. Mary Mead, having arrived only 6 months prior to care for her ailing aunt, Mrs. Lottie Dunhill, whose crumbling manor on the edge of the village was more ivy than stone. Clara was polite, reserved, and kept to herself, which in a village like this was as good as painting a target on one's back for gossip. Some said she was fleeing a broken engagement in London. Others whispered of debts or a scandal too delicate to name. Miss Marple paid little mind to such rumors. They were often more fiction than fact, but she had noted Clara's quiet demeanor, the way her smile never quite reached her eyes, and now this glance, sharp and fleeting, like a crack in a porcelain vase. The man, though, was a puzzle. His polished shoes and tailored coat marked him as an outsider, someone who belonged to the city's clamor rather than the village's calm. Miss Marple scanned the crowd, but he had vanished, leaving only the memory of his dark eyes and the way his hand had twitched, as if resisting the urge to reach for something or someone. She set her teacup down, her movements deliberate, and resumed her knitting. The soft click of the needles a metronome to her thoughts. "Jane, you're awfully quiet today," said Mrs. Bantry, bustling over with a plate of scones. Her round face was flushed from the heat, and her hat a confection of feathers and silk threatened to topple with every enthusiastic gesture. "Not plotting one of your little schemes, are you?" Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling. "Oh, Dolly, you know I'm far too old for schemes. Just enjoying the day and the company." Mrs. Bantry laughed, a hearty sound that turned heads. "Nonsense, you're sharper than half the village put together. Why, I'll bet you've already spotted something we've all missed. Like that business with the missing silver last year solved it in a day, didn't you? Pure luck." Miss Marple demurred, her fingers never faltering on the needles. And a touch of observation. Double quotes. Mrs. Bantry leaned closer, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Well, if you ask me, there's something odd about that Clara Dunhill. Always so jumpy, like a cat in a room full of rocking chairs. And have you seen her aunt's manor? Practically falling apart, yet she claims they've no money troubles. I heard." She paused, glancing around, then plunged on. "I heard there was a theft up there last month. Some old necklace, a family heirloom, vanished right out of a locked drawer." Miss Marple's expression remained placid, but her mind seized the detail like a cat pouncing on a mouse. A missing heirloom, Clara's nervous glance, the stranger's presence. The pieces didn't yet fit, but they were beginning to form a shape. "How dreadful," she said mildly. "I do hope it's found. Such things often turn up in the most unexpected places." Mrs. Bantry nodded, satisfied, and wondered. Off to scold a child for trampling the petunias. Miss Marple's gaze drifted back to Clara, who was now helping at the cake stall. Her movements mechanical, her smile strained. The girl's hands trembled slightly as she handed a slice of Victoria sponge to Mrs. Price, who was too busy complaining about the price of flour to notice. But Miss Marple noticed. She always did. The afternoon wore on, the sun dipping lower, painting the garden in shades of amber and rose. The choir gave way to a fiddler, whose lively tune drew couples to a makeshift dance floor near the gazebo. Miss Marple stayed in her chair, content to watch, her knitting a soft rhythm against the music. She saw Clara slip away from the cake stall, her steps hurried, her head darting as if checking for watchers. She disappeared behind the tea tent, where a row of laurel bushes offered a sliver of privacy. Miss Marple's instincts prickled. She set her knitting in her basket, adjusted her shawl, and rose, her movements slow but purposeful. To anyone watching, she was merely an old woman stretching her legs, perhaps seeking a quieter corner to escape the fiddle's cheerful din. She ambled toward the tea tent, pausing to admire a cluster of daisies, her eyes flicking to the laurel bushes. A murmur of voices reached her, low and urgent, from behind the greenery. "Can't keep doing this." Clara's voice, sharp with panic. "If they find out, they won't," came the reply, a man's voice, smooth and clipped, unmistakably the stranger's. "You just need to stay calm. Follow the plan." Miss Marple edged closer, her footsteps silent on the grass. Through a gap in the leaves, she glimpsed Clara's pale face, her eyes wide, and the man, his back to Miss Marple, his posture rigid. He held something small in his hand, a letter, perhaps, or a card before slipping it into his pocket. "I didn't sign up for this." Clara whispered. It was just the necklace, you said. Just one thing. It's never just one thing, the man said, his tone cool, almost amused. You knew that when you started. Clara shook her head, stepping back. I can't. I won't. You will, he cut in, his voice hardening. Or your aunt's little secrets won't stay secret much longer. The threat hung in the air, heavy as the scent of roses. Clara's shoulders slumped, and she nodded, a defeated gesture that made Miss Marple's heart twinge with pity. The man turned, his profile sharp against the fading light, and strode away, his steps brisk. Clara stood alone, her hands twisting her gloves again. Before she hurried back to the fete, her face a mask of forced composure. Miss Marple retreated to her chair, her mind racing. A missing necklace, a stranger with a hold over Clara, a plan, and secrets that bound them together. It was a knot, tangled and tight, but Miss Marple had unraveled worse. She picked up her knitting, the needles resuming their steady click, and let her thoughts settle. Clara was no thief, she sensed, not willingly, at least. The girl was caught like a fly in a web, and the stranger was spinning the threads. As the fate wound down, the villagers began to drift home, their laughter fading into the dusk. Miss Marple lingered, her eyes on Clara, who was now helping to clear the cake stall, her movements slow, as if weighed down by an invisible burden. The stranger had not reappeared, but Miss Marple knew he wasn't far. Men like that never were. She rose, folding her knitting into her basket, and made her way to Clara, who looked up with a start, her eyes flickering with that same nervous energy. Miss Marple, Clara said, forcing a smile. Did you enjoy the fete very much, my dear? Miss Marple replied, her voice warm, her gaze gentle but piercing. Though I must say, you seem a little out of sorts. Nothing troubling. You, I hope. Clara's smile faltered, her fingers tightening on the edge of a tablecloth. Oh, no. Just tired, I suppose. It's been a long day. Of course, Miss Marple said, nodding. These events can be quite overwhelming. But do take care, Clara. It's easy to get caught up in things one doesn't expect. The words were soft, but they landed like pebbles in a pond, sending ripples through Clara's composure. Her eyes widened for a moment, then darted away. Thank you, Miss Marple, she murmured, turning back to the tablecloth. Miss Marple didn't press further. She bid Clara good evening and started down the lane toward her cottage, the twilight wrapping around her like a shawl. The glance in the garden had been the first thread, and now she had more a whispered threat. A missing heirloom, a stranger with a plan. She would watch Clara, quietly, patiently, as she always did. The truth had a way of revealing itself, especially when one knew where to look. As she reached her gate, the stars beginning to prick the sky, Miss Marple paused, her hand on the latch. She thought of Clara's pale face, the stranger's cold voice, and the necklace that had vanished from a locked drawer. It was a small mystery, perhaps, but small mysteries had a way of growing, like weeds in a garden, and Miss Marple was very good at weeding. She stepped inside, her cottage warm and familiar, and set her basket on the table. Tomorrow, she would call on Mrs. Bantry, who knew more about the Dunhill manor than she let on. For now, though, she would have a cup of tea and let her thoughts settle like leaves in a teapot. The web of deceit was there, waiting to be unraveled, and Miss Marple had seen its first thread in that single, fleeting glance. Chapter 2. Whispers over the teacups. Late summer sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, casting a golden glow across the cobblestone paths and ivy-draped cottages. The village hummed with its usual rhythm, Mrs. Bunce's bakery wafting the scent of fresh scones, the postman's bicycle creaking as he made his rounds, and the distant laughter of children playing near the churchyard. At the heart of the village, the Bluebell Tea Shop stood as a quiet haven, its lace-curtained windows framing a scene of clinking china and murmured conversations. It was here, amid the delicate clatter of teacups, that Miss Jane Marple found herself on a Tuesday afternoon, her knitting needles clicking softly in her hands as she observed the world. With her usual unassuming sharpness, Miss Marple had chosen a corner table by the window, one that offered a clear view of the room and the street beyond. Her soft gray eyes, framed by wire-rimmed spectacles, seemed to drift idly, but they missed nothing. The tea shop was modestly busy, its patrons a mix of locals and a few summer visitors drawn to the village's quaint charm. At the counter, Mrs. Weatherby, the shop's plump and cheerful owner, chatted with a customer about the unseasonably warm weather. A young couple in the opposite corner giggled over a shared slice of Victoria sponge, while an elderly gentleman leafed through a newspaper, muttering about the cricket scores. But Miss Marple's attention was fixed on a solitary figure near the back of the room. Clara Henshaw, the nervous young woman whose furtive glance at the garden party the previous day had piqued her curiosity. Clara sat alone at a small round table, her hands fidgeting with the edge of a linen napkin. Her auburn hair was pinned neatly, but a few strands had escaped, betraying her unease. She wore a simple green dress, its hem slightly frayed, and her eyes darted toward the door every few moments, as if expecting someone or fearing their arrival. A half-empty teacup sat before her, the tea long gone cold. Miss Marple noted the tension in Clara's shoulders, the way her fingers twisted the napkin into knots, and the faint flush on her cheeks that suggested a sleepless night. Something was amiss, and Miss Marple's instincts, honed by years of quiet observation, told her it was more than mere nerves. She adjusted her knitting, a pale blue shawl that was coming along nicely, and took a sip of her Earl Grey. The tea shop was the perfect place to gather the village's pulse, for it was here that tongues loosened and secrets slipped out, often disguised as idle gossip. Miss Marple had learned long ago that the smallest details, a hesitant pause, a too quick smile, could unravel the tightest webs of deceit. And Clara, with her anxious demeanor and that fleeting glance from the garden party, was a thread begging to be pulled. As Miss Marple watched, a man entered the tea shop, the bell above the door jingling softly. He was tall and wary, with sharp features and a slightly disheveled appearance. His tweed jacket was patched at the elbows, and his tie was askew. He carried a leather satchel slung over one shoulder, and his dark eyes scanned the room before settling on Clara. She stiffened, visibly, her hands freezing mid-twist. The man approached her table with a forced smile, pulling out a chair without waiting for an invitation. "Clara, my dear," he said, his voice low but carrying a practiced charm. "You're looking rather pale. Not sleeping well." Miss Marple's needles paused for a fraction of a second. The man's tone was too familiar, too smooth, and Clara's reaction, a mix of wariness and resignation, confirmed that their connection was not entirely welcome. She leaned closer, her ears attuned to their conversation, though she kept her gaze on her knitting. The picture of an innocuous elderly lady. "I'm fine, Mr. Harrow," Clara replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't need to come here." "Oh, but I did," Mr. Harrow said, leaning back in his chair with an air of casual authority. "We have matters to discuss, don't we? That little obligation of yours isn't going away." Clara's eyes dropped to the table, her fingers tightening around the napkin. "I told you, I need more time. It's not as simple as you think." Miss Marple's mind raced. An obligation. The word carried weight, hinting at a debt or promise that held Clara in its grip. She recalled the garden party, where Clara had exchanged that fleeting glance with a man, possibly this Mr. Harrow, while standing near the manor's rose garden, where the theft of a valuable sapphire brooch had been discovered later that evening. The brooch, a family heirloom belonging to the Henshaws, was said to be worth a small fortune, though its sentimental value far outweighed its price. Could Clara's obligation be tied to the theft? Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the Henshaws' financial troubles, a topic that had surfaced in village gossip. Their estate, once prosperous, was rumored to be crumbling under debts left by Clara's late father, Dotmer. Harold leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. Time is a luxury you don't have, Clara. Mr. Grayson is not a patient man, and neither am I. You know what's at stake. The name Grayson sent a ripple through Miss Marple's thoughts. She knew of a Mr. Edward Grayson, a London banker with a reputation for ruthless dealings. Though he kept a low profile in St. Mary Mead, his name had surfaced once or twice in connection with local investments gone sour. If he was involved, the web was larger than she'd imagined. Clara's voice trembled. I didn't ask for this, you know that. If Thomas hadn't, Mr. Harrow cut her off, glancing around the tea shop. His eyes briefly met Miss Marple's, and she quickly averted her gaze, fussing with her knitting. Not here. We'll talk later. Meet me at the old mill at 8. Bring what you promised. Clara nodded reluctantly, her face pale. Mr. Harrow stood, adjusted his satchel, and left the tea shop with a brisk stride. The bell jingled again, and Clara slumped in her chair, her hands covering her face. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind piecing together the fragments. Thomas, Clara's older brother, was known for his reckless habits, guards, horses, and a penchant for late nights at the pub. If he was entangled in this obligation, it could explain Clara's distress. The mention of the old mill, a crumbling relic on the edge of the village, suggested a clandestine meeting, one Miss Marple intended to observe from a safe distance. She glanced at her watch. 3:30. There was time to make a few discreet inquiries before evening. Finishing her tea, she tucked her knitting into her bag and approached the counter, where Mrs. Weatherby was polishing a teapot with a vigor that suggested she'd heard every word of Clara's exchange. Lovely tea as always, Mrs. Weatherby, Miss Marple said with a warm smile. Though I couldn't help noticing young Clara Henshaw. She seems rather out of sorts today. Mrs. Weatherby's eyes gleamed with the delight of shared gossip. Oh, Miss Marple, you've no idea. Poor Clara's been like a ghost these past weeks. Ever since that brooch went missing, the Henshaws have been in a state. Word is, they're up to their ears in debt. Her brother, Thomas, you know he's been seen with some shady types. That man who was just here, Mr. Harrow. He's no good, if you ask me. Always poking about, asking questions about antiques and such. Antiques, Miss Marple's tone was innocently curious. Does he deal in them? So he says, Mrs. Weatherby replied, lowering her voice. Runs a shop in Chipping Cleghorn. But I've heard he's mixed up in things that aren't so above board. Clara's been seen with him before, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. How dreadful. For her. Young people do get themselves into such tangles, don't they? Don't they just? Mrs. Weatherby sighed. Mind you, I heard Clara's been trying to sell off some family silver to keep the creditors at bay. Pity. Really, the Henshaws were such a proud lot once. Thanking Mrs. Weatherby, Miss Marple stepped out into the warm afternoon, her mind buzzing. The connection between Clara, Mr. Harrow, and the mysterious Mr. Grayson was becoming clearer, though the details remained elusive. The sapphire brooches. Theft was no random act. It was tied to the Henshaws' financial woes. and possibly to a larger scheme involving Harrow's antiques trade. But what role did Clara play? Was she a reluctant accomplice, or merely a pawn in someone else's game? As she walked toward the vicarage, hoping to glean more from the vicar's endless stories, Miss Marple passed the village green, where a group of children were playing a lively game of tag. Their laughter was a stark contrast to the tension she'd witnessed in the tea shop. She paused, watching them for a moment, and her thoughts drifted to her own youth, when life seemed simpler, though no less full of secrets. People, she mused, were much like those children running about, chasing their desires, unaware of the shadows cast by their actions. The vicarage was a short walk away, its rose-covered walls glowing in the sunlight. The vicar, Mr. Clement, was a kind but absent-minded man, prone to long-winded tales that often held unexpected nuggets of truth. Miss Marple knocked on the door, greeted by the vicar's wife, Griselda, who ushered her inside with a cheerful wave. "Miss Marple, what a treat," Griselda said, her youthful energy filling the room. "Leonard's in the study, wrestling with his sermon. Shall I fetch him?" "No need to trouble him," Miss Marple said. "I was just passing by and thought I'd pop in for a chat. I've been hearing such curious things about the Henshaws lately." Griselda's eyes widened. "Oh, haven't we all? That missing brooch has everyone talking. Leonard saw something odd the night it disappeared, you know. He was out walking and spotted a man near the manor, someone he didn't recognize." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "Did he? Now? What sort of man?" Griselda leaned in, her voice conspiratorial. "Tall, thin, with a satchel. Leonard said he looked like he was up to no good, skulking about the hedges. Could be that Mr. Harrow fellow, don't you think?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her tone non-committal. "It's curious how strangers seem to appear just when things go missing." The conversation was interrupted by the vicar's arrival, his glasses perched precariously on his nose. "Miss Marple, always a pleasure. Griselda's been filling your head with her theories, I suppose?" "Only the truth, Leonard," Griselda teased. "Tell her about the man you saw." Mr. Clement launched into a rambling account of his evening walk, describing the stranger's sharp features and hurried gait. The description matched Mr. Harrow perfectly, confirming Miss Marple's suspicions. She listened patiently, asking gentle questions that steered the vicar toward useful details, without betraying her intent. By the time she left the vicarage, the sun was dipping toward the horizon, and she had a clearer picture of the puzzle. The old mill, where Clara was to meet Mr. Harrow, stood on the outskirts of St. Mary Mead, its weathered stones overgrown with ivy. It was a place rarely visited, its creaking waterwheel long silent, making it an ideal spot for secrecy. Miss Marple had no intention of confronting anyone herself. Such boldness was for younger, brasher souls, but she knew the value of observation. Slipping on a dark shawl and her sturdiest shoes, she set out as dusk settled, her steps light and purposeful. The path to the mill wound through a copse of trees, their branches casting long shadows in the fading light. Miss Marple moved quietly, her senses alert. The air was cool now, carrying the scent of damp earth and wild flowers. As she neared the mill, she heard voices low, urgent, and unmistakably Clara's and Mr. Harrow's. "You don't understand," Clara was saying, her voice breaking. "I can't keep doing this. It's wrong." "Wrong?" Mr. Harrow's tone was mocking. "You're in too deep to play the innocent now, Clara. Hand it over, and we'll be done for tonight." Miss Marple crouched behind a thicket, her heart steady despite the tension. She couldn't see them clearly, but the faint glow of a lantern illuminated their silhouettes against the mill's wall. Clara reached into her coat, producing a small parcel wrapped in cloth. Mr. Harrow snatched it, unwrapping it to reveal a glint of silver, a candlestick, perhaps, or some other heirloom. He inspected it briefly before tucking it into his satchel. "This'll do for now," he said. "But Grayson expects more. You know that." Clara's voice was barely audible. "I didn't want any of this. It was Thomas's idea." "Then tell your brother to stop gambling away what little you have left," Mr. Harrow snapped. "Meet me in Chipping Cleghorn tomorrow. And don't be late." He turned and strode away. His footsteps fading into the night, Clara stood motionless, her shoulders shaking as she stifled a sob. Miss Marple waited until she was certain Mr. Harrow was gone before emerging from her hiding place. Clara started at the sound of her approach, her eyes wide with fear. "Miss Marple," she gasped. "What are you doing here?" "Taking an evening stroll, my dear," Miss Marple said calmly, her tone soothing. "The mill is such a peaceful spot, don't you think? Though it seems you've had a rather trying evening." Clara's eyes filled with tears. I don't know what to do. It's all gone so wrong." Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on her arm. "There's always a way out of tangles, Clara. But you must be honest. Tell me, what hold does Mr. Harrow have over you?" Clara hesitated, then shook her head. "I can't. It's too dangerous. You don't understand what they're capable of." "Perhaps not," Miss Marple said softly. "But I understand more than you might think. Go home, my dear, and get some rest. We'll talk again soon." Clara nodded, wiping her eyes, and hurried off into the darkness. Miss Marple watched her go, her mind already turning to the next step. The parcel Clara had given Mr. Harrow was another piece of the Henshaw family's legacy, likely sold to settle debts or worse, to fuel Thomas's gambling. Mr. Grayson's involvement suggested a larger scheme, one that extended beyond St. Mary Mead. And Mr. Harrow, with his antique shop and coded ledgers, was the key to unraveling. It dawned as Miss Marple made her way back to her cottage. The village was quiet, the stars bright overhead. She passed the tea shop, now dark, and thought of the cryptic note Clara had received earlier that day. It had been slipped under her saucer when Mrs. Weatherby wasn't looking. A folded scrap of paper with a single line. "The mill, 8 o'clock. Don't disappoint." Miss Marple had seen it only briefly, but it was enough to confirm her suspicions. Someone was pulling strings, and Clara was caught in the middle. Settling into her armchair with a cup of chamomile tea, Miss Marple reflected on the day's discoveries. The web of deceit was intricate, but not unbreakable. Tomorrow, she would visit Chipping Cleghorn and Mr. Harrow's antique shop, posing as a curious customer. There, she might find the next clue, a ledger, a letter, or perhaps another name to add to the growing list. For now, she was content to let the pieces settle, trusting that her one piercing look had set the unraveling in motion. The fire crackled softly in her cottage, and outside, the village slept under a blanket of stars. Miss Marple smiled to herself, her knitting resting in her lap. The game was afoot, and she was ready to play her part. Chapter 3. The vicar's curious telleth late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone path leading to St. Mary Mead's modest vicarage, its ivy-clad walls glowing with a soft, golden warmth. Miss Jane Marple, her sensible hat tilted slightly against the breeze, walked with a measured step, her eyes bright with purpose. The village was still abuzz with whispers of the missing heirloom sapphire brooch, passed down through the Langley family for generations, last seen pinned to Lady Langley's shawl at the garden party. Its disappearance had stirred the kind of quiet scandal that thrived in a place like St. Mary Mead, where secrets were as common as tea kettles, but rarely stayed hidden long. Miss Marple's interest had been piqued 2 days prior, at that very garden party, when her sharp gaze caught a fleeting exchange and nervous glance between Clara Langley, the family's youngest daughter, and an unfamiliar man who vanished into the crowd. Clara's fidgeting hands and darting eyes had betrayed something more than mere social unease. Then, at the tea shop yesterday, Miss Marple had overheard Clara whisper of a debt, her voice trembling with a fear that hinted at deeper troubles. Now, with the village gossip mill churning, Miss Marple sought the one person who might hold a piece of the puzzle, the vicar, Mr. Clement, whose knack for collecting stray stories rivaled her own. The vicarage door creaked open, revealing Mr. Clement's kind, slightly flustered face. "Miss Marple, what a delight," he said, ushering her into the cozy parlor, where a fire crackled despite the mild weather. "I was just wrestling with tomorrow's sermon. Tea?" "Only if it's no trouble," Miss Marple replied, settling into a worn armchair. Her eyes scanned the room, noting the cluttered bookshelves, a half-finished crossword on the table, and a curious brass figurine of a shepherdess that seemed out of place among the vicar's modest belongings. "No trouble at all," Mr. Clement said, bustling toward the kitchen. "Griselda's out visiting the sick, so I'm left to my own devices. I dare say I make a better pot than she does, though don't tell her I said so." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her mind already sifting through the threads of the mystery. The vicar returned with a tray, the teapot steaming, and two mismatched cups clinking softly. As he poured, she steered the conversation with the gentle precision of a gardener pruning roses. "I've been thinking about the Langley affair," she said, her tone light but deliberate. "Such a pity about their brooch. Have you heard anything unusual?" Mr. Clement's eyebrows rose, his hands pausing mid-pour. "Unusual. Well, now that you mention it," he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, as if the walls themselves might eavesdrop. "There was something odd. A stranger, you see, spotted near the manor the night before the garden party. Mrs. Price swears she saw him lurking by the orchard gate, bold as brass, though it was near dusk." Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly on her teacup. "A stranger? That's curious indeed. Did Mrs. Price describe him?" "Oh, yes. She's got an eye for detail when it suits her," Mr. Clement said, chuckling. "Tall," she said, with a sharp sort of face hawk-like, was her word. "Dark coat, a bit too fine for a rambler, and a hat pulled low. She thought he was up to no good, skulking about like that. Mind you, Mrs. Price does love a story, but I saw the man myself the next morning near the churchyard. He was watching the manor from across the lane, and when I called out, he was off like a shot." Miss Marple's mind whirred. A stranger near the manor, the night before the brooch vanished, and Clara, seen yesterday at the tea shop with a man, whose description tall, sharp-featured, dark-coated matched the vicar's tale. Could it be the same person? She sipped her tea, her expression serene, but her thoughts racing. Did he speak to anyone, this stranger? Or was he alone? "Alone, as far as I know," Mr. Clement said, rubbing his chin. "Though Mrs. Price did say something about him carrying a satchel, the kind you'd expect from a peddler. But he didn't look the type. Too polished, if you take my meaning. I thought perhaps he was a surveyor or some such, but no one's heard of any land deals round here." Miss Marple nodded, filing away the detail of the satchel. "And the manor, has anyone else mentioned visitors?" "The Langleys have been rather quiet since the theft." Mr. Clement hesitated, his fingers drumming on the arm of his chair. "Well, now, that's another thing. Young Tommy Langley Clara's brother came by yesterday, looking like he hadn't slept in days. Asked if I'd heard of anyone selling jewelry in the village. I told him no, but he seemed desperate. Kept muttering about making things right. I didn't press him, poor lad, but it struck me as odd. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed behind her spectacles. Thomas Langley, desperate and asking about jewelry. The pieces were beginning to align, like the squares of a quilt she'd once watched her niece stitch together, each fragment meaningless, until placed just so. Clara's anxiety, the stranger. Thomas's agitation, it all pointed to a tangle of motives, perhaps financial, perhaps personal. But she needed more. Desperate, she mused aloud, her voice soft. That's a heavy word for a young man like Thomas. The Langleys have always been proud. But pride doesn't pay debts, does it? Mr. Clement blinked, caught off guard by her shift in tone. Debts? I hadn't thought. But yes, I've heard whispers. Old Mr. Langley's investments went sour before he passed, or so they say. Clara's been keeping the household together, but it can't be easy. Miss Marple set her teacup down, her movements deliberate. No, it can't. Tell me, Mr. Clement, have you heard of anyone new in the antiques trade, someone who might deal in delicate items? The vicar's face lit up, as if he'd been waiting for the question. Funny you should ask. There's a fellow in Chipping Cleghorn, a Mr. Harrow, who's set up an antiques shop in the past year. Bit of a mystery. That one keeps to himself. But I've heard he's got a knack for finding rare pieces. Some say he's not above bending the rules to get them. Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. Mr. Harrow, you say? In Chipping Cleghorn. How very interesting. She rose, smoothing her skirt. Thank you, Mr. Clement. You've been most helpful. I mustn't keep you from your sermon. Oh, it's no trouble at all, he said, standing to see her out. But, Miss Marple, you don't think the stranger and the brooch? I think, she said, her eyes twinkling with that quiet certainty that unnerved even the most skeptical, that a village is never as simple as it seems. Good day, Mr. Clement. As she stepped back onto the cobblestone path, the vicar's tale spun through her mind like a spool of thread. A stranger with a satchel, a desperate Thomas, a shadowy antiques dealer named Harrow, and Clara, at the heart of it. Her glance in the garden a spark that had ignited this chain of clues. Miss Marple resolved to visit Chipping Cleghorn and Mr. Harrow's shop. If the brooch was part of a larger scheme, as she suspected, the answers lay there, hidden among dusty relics and guarded secrets. The walk back to her cottage was brisk, the evening air sharp with the scent of autumn leaves. St. Mary Mead lay quiet, its thatched roofs and tidy gardens belying the undercurrents of deceit that Miss Marple knew ran beneath its surface. She thought of her old friend, Dolly Bantry, who once remarked that villages were like ponds calm on top, but teeming with life below. And Miss Marple, with her one piercing look, was adept at spotting the ripples dot at home. She lit a fire and settled into her armchair, her knitting needles clicking softly as she pondered. The stranger's description matched the man Clara had met, but was he a thief, a messenger, or something else? Thomas's desperation suggested a family in distress, perhaps driven to drastic measures. And Mr. Harrow, his name was new, but his trade in rare pieces hinted at a man who dealt in more than just antiques. Miss Marple's needles paused as she recalled a similar case years ago, in St. Mary Mead, when a stolen necklace had turned up in a pawn shop 2 towns over, sold by a young man who'd fallen in with the wrong crowd. History, she knew, had a way of repeating itself, especially in human nature. The next morning, Miss Marple boarded the early bus to Chipping Cleghorn, her basket stocked with a skein of wool and a notebook disguised as a recipe collection. The countryside rolled past, fields dappled with morning mist, but her mind was elsewhere. She pictured the antique shop a dimly lit place, no doubt, with glass cases and locked drawers where secrets could be tucked away as easily as a brooch. Mr. Harrow, if he was involved, would not be forthcoming. But Miss Marple had ways of loosening tongues. A kind word, a feigned ignorance. A well-timed question she'd learned long ago that people revealed more when they thought they were in control. Chipping Cleghorn was a bustling market town, its high street lined with shops and a scattering of tea rooms. Mr. Harrow's shop, Harrow's Curios, stood at the far end, its sign faded but elegant, promising treasures within. Miss Marple pushed open the door, a bell jingling softly. The interior was as she'd imagined, shelves crowded with porcelain figurines, tarnished silver, and old clocks, the air thick with the scent of polish and time. Behind the counter stood a man in his 50s, lean and sharp-eyed, his smile just a touch too polished. "Good morning," he said, his voice smooth as velvet. Looking for something special, Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling with practiced warmth. "Oh, just browsing, Mr. Harrow, is it? I've a fondness for old jewelry, you see, brooches in particular. My late aunt had one much like the Langley piece sapphire, wasn't it? Such a shame it's gone missing." Mr. Harrow's smile didn't falter, but his fingers twitched, betraying a flicker of unease. "A shame indeed," he said. "I've heard of the theft, terrible business. But I've no sapphires here, I'm afraid. Perhaps a cameo?" Miss Marple wandered to a glass case, peering at a display of lockets. "Oh, I'm not particular. Though I did hear a rumor silly village talk, of course about a stranger in St. Mary Mead, carrying a satchel. Someone thought he might be a dealer passing through. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" The question hung in the air, light as a feather but sharp as a pin. Mr. Harrow's eyes narrowed, just for a moment, before he laughed. "Strangers come and go, Miss Marple," she supplied, her tone guileless. "Jane Marple. Yes, I suppose they do, still. It's curious, isn't it? A theft, a stranger, and also close to home. Curious, but not my concern," Mr. Harrow said, busying himself with a ledger. "I deal in honest trade, Miss Marple. No strangers with satchels here." She nodded, as if satisfied, but her eyes lingered on the ledger, a thick, leather-bound book with a lock that looked more decorative than secure. "Of course," she said. "Well, I shan't take up your time. Thank you, Mr. Harrow." As she left, the bell jingling behind her, Miss Marple felt a quiet thrill. The ledger was the key, she was certain of it. If Mr. Harrow was fencing stolen goods, as she suspected, that book held the evidence. But she needed a way to see it, and that would require more than a casual visit. Perhaps an evening return, when the shop was closed and the street quiet. It was a bold plan for a woman of her age, but Miss Marple had never shied away from boldness when it served justice. Back in St. Mary Mead, she stopped by the post office, where Mrs. Price was holding court with her usual audience of gossips. "Miss Marple," she called, waving her over. "Have you heard? Clara Langley was seen crying by the river this morning. Crying, I tell you. And her brother's been asking about that stranger again. Something's not right with that family." Miss Marple listened, her face a mask of polite interest, but her mind was already weaving the threads together. Clara's tears, Thomas's questions, the stranger, and Mr. Harrow's ledger. The web was tightening, and she was close to its center. That evening, as the village settled into its quiet rhythm, she sat by her window, knitting forgotten in her lap. Tomorrow, she would return to Chipping Cleghorn. The ledger, she decided, would tell her what Mr. Harrow was hiding and whether the stranger, Clara, and the missing brooch were part of a larger deceit. The chapter closed with Miss Marple gazing out at the darkening garden, her eyes sharp and unyielding. A single look that could unravel any lie, no matter how carefully spun. Chapter 4. Shadows in the antique shop. The village of St. Mary Mead lay cloaked in the soft haze of an early autumn afternoon. Its cobblestone lanes dappled with the golden light filtering through ancient oaks. Miss Jane Marple, her silver hair tucked neatly beneath a modest felt hat, stepped out of the vicarage with a purposeful air, her knitting bag swinging lightly from her arm. The vicar's tale of a stranger lurking near the manor, where the Ashby family heirloom, a sapphire-encrusted locket, had vanished, still echoed in her mind. The description of the man, with his sharp features and restless eyes, had matched someone Clara, the nervous young woman from the garden party, had been seen with. Now, Miss Marple's destination was clear. Harrow's Antiques, a dimly lit shop at the edge of the village, where whispers of shady dealings had long lingered like dust on forgotten shelves. The shop's bell jingled as she pushed open the door, releasing a faint scent of old wood and wax polish. The interior was a labyrinth of curiosities, mahogany tables cluttered with porcelain figurines, tarnished silver candelabras, and stacks of leather-bound books that seemed to lean toward her, as if sharing secrets. The air was thick with the weight of history, and Miss Marple's sharp eyes darted from one shadow to another, noting every detail. A cracked mirror reflecting a sliver of the street outside, a brass clock ticking unevenly, and a velvet curtain half drawn across a doorway at the back. Harrow, the shop's proprietor, emerged from behind the counter, his thin frame stooped as if bowed by the weight of his own secrets. His eyes, small and flinty, flickered with recognition as he greeted her. "Miss Marple, what a rare pleasure," he said, his voice smooth but edged with caution. "Are you in search of something particular today?" "Oh, nothing too grand, Mr. Harrow," she replied, her tone light, almost airy, as she adjusted her spectacles. "Just browsing, you know. I've always had a fondness for old things, lockets, perhaps, or trinkets with a bit of history." She let the word locket linger, her gaze steady but unassuming, as if she were merely a curious spinster with too much time on her hands. Harrow's smile tightened, a muscle twitching at the corner of his mouth. "Lockets, you say? I'm afraid we've none at the moment. They're rather rare, you see, especially ones with sapphires." His fingers drummed lightly on the counter, betraying a flicker of unease. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of mild surprise. "Oh, how curious. I'd heard you were the man to see for such treasures. Perhaps I was mistaken." She moved toward a display of tarnished jewelry, her fingers brushing a chipped cameo brooch as she continued. "You must hear all sorts of stories in a place like this. Village gossip can be so illuminating." Harrow's eyes narrowed, but he forced a chuckle. "Gossip's just noise, Miss Marple. Ideal intangibles, wood, silver, glass. Stories don't pay the bills." "Of course," she murmured, her gaze drifting to a heavy oak desk in the corner, its surface cluttered with papers and a leather-bound ledger. The ledger's cover was worn, its edges frayed, and a faint smudge of ink stained the corner, as if someone had handled it in haste. "Still, I imagine you meet interesting folk. Travelers, perhaps, or gentlemen from London with a taste for rare things." Harrow's fingers stilled. "I keep to myself, mostly. Customers come and go." He stepped toward the desk, casually nudging the ledger out of sight. "Can I show you a nice set of teacups? Victorian, very fine." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling with warmth that belied their sharpness. "Perhaps another time. I'm rather taken with that desk, though. Such craftsmanship. Do you keep your records there?" "Records?" Harrow's voice sharpened, though he quickly softened it. "Oh, just bills and such. Nothing of interest to a lady like yourself." She nodded, as if satisfied, and turned toward a shelf of dusty vases, but her mind was racing. The ledger had caught her eye the moment. She entered a faint irregularity in its placement, as if it had been hastily closed. Her years in St. Mary Mead had taught her that secrets were often hidden in plain sight, tucked away in the mundane details of everyday life. A ledger, to her, was no mere book of accounts. It was a map of motives, a cipher of sins. As Harrow busied himself rearranging a display of brass candlesticks, Miss Marple drifted closer to the desk, her steps silent on the worn rug. She pretended to admire a cracked porcelain shepherdess, her fingers grazing the desk's edge. The ledger was just out of reach, half hidden beneath a stack of yellowed invoices. She needed a distraction. "Mr. Harrow," she called, her voice tinged with sudden concern. "I do believe that clock on the wall is about to fall. It's tilting rather alarmingly." Harrow spun around, his eyes darting to the brass clock, which sat perfectly level on its shelf. "The clock. I don't." He hesitated, caught off guard, and in that moment, Miss Marple's nimble fingers slid the ledger free. She flipped it open, her eyes scanning the pages with the speed of a hawk spotting prey. Rows of numbers and names danced before her, written in a cramped, meticulous hand. Most were mundane purchases of vases, sales of chairs, but one entry caught her breath. "Locket, sapphire, Ashby Estate, £500, pending delivery to LA Lord Ashby." Her mind whirred. The Ashby family, whose manor housed the missing heirloom, had long been whispered about in the village, rumors of debts, of a fortune squandered, of a desperate need to reclaim their former glory. Could the locket's theft be tied to their own patriarch? And what did pending delivery mean? Was the locket still here, hidden among the shop's shadows? She snapped the ledger shut just as Harrow turned back, his brow furrowed. "The clock seems fine, Miss Marple." "Oh, my mistake," she said, her voice all innocence. "These old eyes, you know. I must be more tired than I thought." She stepped away from the desk, her heart pounding but her face serene. "I'll not take up more of your time, Mr. Harrow. Though I wonder, do you ever deal with Lord Ashby? I hear he's fond of antiques." Harrow's face froze, his eyes darting to the desk before he caught himself. "Lord Ashby? I've sold him a few pieces over the years. Nothing remarkable." His words were clipped, his fingers twitching as if itching to check the ledger. "Of course," Miss Marple said, her smile unwavering. "Well, I must be off. Thank you for indulging an old woman's curiosity." She moved toward the door, her knitting bag brushing against her side. But as she reached for the handle, a shadow flickered behind the velvet curtain at the back of the shop. A faint rustle, like the whisper of fabric, reached her ears. She paused, her hand hovering over the doorknob. "Oh, Mr. Harrow, is someone else here? I thought I heard a noise." Harrow's face paled, but he recovered quickly. "Just the wind, Miss Marple. This old building creaks like my bones." She nodded, as if satisfied, but her mind was alight with suspicion. The curtain had moved not with the breeze, but with purpose. Someone was listening, watching, perhaps waiting for her to leave. She stepped outside, the bell jingling behind her, and made a show of adjusting her hat as she glanced through the shop's window. Harrow was already at the desk, his hands on the ledger, his face taut with worry. The street outside was quiet, save for the distant clop of a horse-drawn cart. Miss Marple walked slowly, her mind piecing together the fragments of what she'd seen. The ledger's entry, the mention of Lord Ashby, the shadow behind the curtain, all pointed to a web far larger than a single stolen locket. Harrow was no mere shopkeeper. He was a cog in a machine, and the locket was a key to something greater. But what, and who was hiding in the shadows? She turned down a narrow alley, her steps deliberate, and paused beside a crumbling stone wall. From her knitting bag, she withdrew a small notebook and pencil, jotting down the ledger's entry. Locket. Sapphire. Ashby Estate. £500, pending delivery to LA beneath it, she added. Curtain moved. Someone listening. Her handwriting was neat, precise, a reflection of her orderly mind. She tucked the notebook away, her thoughts drifting to Clara, the nervous young woman whose furtive glance had started it all. Clara's family, the vicar had said, was in financial ruin. Was she a pawn in the scheme, or something more? As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the village, Miss Marple made her way to the post office, a squat building with ivy crawling up its walls. Inside, Mrs. Clary, the postmistress, was sorting letters, her glasses perched precariously on her nose. "Miss Marple," she exclaimed, her voice warm. "What brings you here so late?" "Just a small errand," Miss Marple said, her tone conspiratorial. "I was wondering, Mrs. Clary, if you've noticed any unusual packages going to or from Harrow's Antiques. I'm thinking of buying something, you see, but I'd like to know more about his business. Double quotes. Mrs. Clary's eyes gleamed with the delight of gossip. "Well, now that you mention it, there was a parcel last week, big, heavy thing, addressed to a Mr. Grayson in London. Came from Harrow's shop, but it was marked fragile in a way that seemed odd. Too much tape, if you ask me, like they didn't want it opened." "Mr. Grayson, you say?" Miss Marple's voice was soft, but her mind was racing. A London connection, and a name she hadn't heard before. How interesting. And the address? Oh, I shouldn't say, but well, since it's you, Miss Marple, it was 17 Willow Lane, London. A posh part of town, mind you. "Thank you, Mrs. Clary," Miss Marple said, her smile warm, but her eyes sharp. "You've been most helpful." She left the post office, the address burning in her mind. 17 Willow Lane. A lead, solid and tangible, like a thread she could tie to unravel the entire web. As she walked home, the village settling into the quiet of evening, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Lord Ashby, his name in the ledger, his family's connection to the locket, and now this mysterious Mr. Grayson. It all pointed to a scheme that reached beyond St. Mary Mead, into the glittering, treacherous world of London's elite. She would need to tread carefully, for the shadows in the antique shop were not just hiding secrets. They were guarding them with intent. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple lit a single lamp and settled into her armchair, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically. The ledger's entry, the curtain's movement, Mrs. Clary's gossip, they were pieces of a puzzle, and she was beginning to see its shape. Tomorrow, she would write to her nephew, Raymond, in London, asking him to discreetly inquire about 17 Willow Lane. For now, she let her mind wander, her needles weaving not just wool but the threads of a mystery that was growing darker, deeper, and far more dangerous than she first imagined. The night closed around St. Mary Mead, and Miss Marple's cottage glowed softly in the darkness, a beacon of quiet resolve. The locket was more than a stolen trinket. It was a key to a fortune, a scandal, or perhaps both. And Miss Marple, with her one piercing look, was determined to unlock its secrets. Chapter 5. The Ashby Manor masqueradeth. Late summer air hung heavy with the scent of roses and intrigue as Miss Jane Marple stepped out of the hired car onto the gravel drive of Ashby Manor. The grand estate loomed before her, its ivy-clad walls glowing under the golden light of dusk. Torches flickered along the pathway, casting dancing shadows that seemed to whisper secrets of their own. Tonight, the manor hosted Lord Ashby's annual masquerade ball, an event renowned in St. Mary Mead for its opulence and the curious anonymity it afforded its guests. For Miss Marple, It was no mere social occasion, but a carefully chosen stage to unravel the threads of deceit. She'd been quietly tugging since that fateful glance in the village garden. Clad in a modest yet elegant black gown, her silver hair swept beneath a delicate lace mask, Miss Marple blended effortlessly into the crowd of masked revelers, streaming toward the manor's entrance. Her attire was chosen with precision, not ostentatious enough to draw attention, but refined enough to pass as one of the gentry. She carried a small fan, not for comfort, but as a prop to conceal her watchful eyes. The invitation, secured through a discreet favor from the vicar's cousin, was tucked safely in her reticule, a ticket to the heart of the mystery surrounding the missing heirloom dot as she crossed the threshold into the grand ballroom. The scene unfolded like a painting come to life. Crystal chandeliers glittered overhead, their light refracting through the masks of lords, ladies, and less savory characters who moved in a kaleidoscope of silks and satins. A string quartet played a lilting waltz, and the air buzzed with laughter and the clink of champagne flutes. Yet beneath the gaiety, Miss Marple sensed an undercurrent of tension, as if the room itself held its breath, waiting for a secret to slip. Her eyes scanned the crowd for Clara, the nervous young woman whose furtive glance had first caught her attention weeks ago. Clara's connection to the stolen heirloom, a sapphire-encrusted locket passed down through her family for generations, had become clearer with each step of Miss Marple's investigation. The locket's theft, she suspected, was no simple act of greed, but a key to a larger scheme, one that now seemed to involve the shadowy antiques dealer, Mr. Harrow, and possibly Lord Ashby himself. Miss Marple's gaze settled on a figure near the far end of the ballroom, standing by a tall window draped in burgundy velvet. Clara, unmistakable even in her emerald green gown and feathered mask, was engaged in a heated exchange with a man whose lean frame and sharp gestures matched Mr. Harrow's description. Their voices were lost in the music, but their body language spoke volumes. Clara's hands twisted nervously at her sides, while Harrow's posture was predatory, leaning in as if to press an advantage. Slipping through the crowd, Miss Marple positioned herself near a marble pillar, close enough to overhear without being noticed. She fluttered her fan, her eyes darting between the dancers and her quarry. The music swelled, masking her approach, and she caught fragments of their conversation. "You promised it would be discreet," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "If Thomas finds out, he won't," Harrow cut in, his tone smooth but edged with menace. "The locket is safe, and the auction is set. You'll get your share, Clara, but only if you keep your nerve." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. An auction. So the locket was not merely stolen, but destined for a clandestine sale, likely tied to the black market dealings she'd glimpsed in Harrow's coded ledger. And Clara's mention of Thomas, her brother, no doubt suggested he was either complicit or a liability. The plot was thickening, and Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of a puzzle coming into focus. She drifted closer, pausing to admire a vase of lilies as if lost in thought. Harrow's next words sent a shiver through her. "Lord Ashby expects results. The locket's not just a trinket, it's the key to everything. If you falter now, we all lose." Lord Ashby. The name confirmed her suspicions. The manor's lord, with his polished charm and rumored financial troubles, was no bystander in this affair. But what was the locket's true significance, and why was Clara, a girl of modest means, entangled with such dangerous players? Before Miss Marple could glean more, the music paused, and a liveried servant announced a new dance. The crowd shifted, pulling Clara and Harrow apart as partners were claimed for a quadrille. Miss Marple seized the moment, gliding toward a side corridor where she'd noticed a discreet door earlier. It led, she suspected, to the manor's private rooms, where secrets might be less guarded. The corridor was dimly lit, its walls adorned with portraits of Ashby ancestors whose stern gazes seemed to follow her. She moved silently, her sensible shoes making no sound on the polished floor. The door at the end was ajar, revealing a small study lit by a single candelabrum. Inside, two men spoke in low tones, their masks discarded on a table. One was Lord Ashby himself, his aquiline features unmistakable. The other, a weary man with a scar above his brow, was unfamiliar, but carried the air of someone accustomed to working in shadows. Miss Marple pressed herself against the wall, her fan raised to obscure her face. The men's voices were hushed, but clear. The locket's provenance is verified, the scarred man said, tapping a folder on the desk. It's tied to the Ashby estate's original deed. Whoever controls it controls the claim. Lord Ashby's jaw tightened. And Grayson, he's still pressing for his cut. He's greedy, but he's manageable. The auction will settle it. The locket, the deed, the whole lot sold to the highest bidder. Miss Marple's mind raced. The locket was no mere heirloom. It was a legal linchpin, likely tied to a disputed claim on the Ashby estate itself, a forged will, perhaps, or a hidden clause in an ancient deed. Her visit to Harrow's shop had hinted at such schemes, but this was the first confirmation of their scale, and Grayson, whoever he was, added another layer to the web. She retreated as the men rose, slipping back into the ballroom before they could notice her. The music had shifted to a lively polka, and the crowd was a whirl of color and motion. Clara was nowhere to be seen, but Harrow lingered near a refreshment table, his eyes scanning the room. Miss Marple decided to test her luck. Approaching the table, she adopted the slightly flustered air of an elderly aunt. "Oh, dear me," she said, fumbling with her fan. "These modern dances are quite beyond me. Are you enjoying the evening, sir?" Harrow turned, his expression guarded but polite. "Tolerably, madam. And you?" "Oh, quite. Though I confess, I'm rather fond of old treasures, lockets, for instance. So sentimental, don't you think?" She watched his reaction closely, noting the slight twitch of his mouth. "Lockets are charming," he said carefully, "but easily lost in a crowd like this. Or sold, perhaps." Miss Marple's tone was light, but her eyes were sharp. Behind her mask, Harrow stiffened, and for a moment, she thought he might bolt. Instead, he forced a smile. "You have a keen imagination, madam. If you'll excuse me." He bowed and melted into the crowd, leaving Miss Marple with the distinct impression she'd struck a nerve. The evening wore on, and Miss Marple kept her distance, observing the ebb and flow of the guests. She noted Clara's reappearance, now dancing with a young man who seemed overly attentive, and Lord Ashby's brief absence from the ballroom, likely to continue his clandestine meeting. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture was still incomplete. As midnight approached, a ripple of excitement passed through the crowd. A servant announced a special event, a masked procession through the manor's gardens, lit by lanterns and culminating in a fireworks display. Miss Marple saw her chance. The gardens, less crowded and poorly lit, would be the perfect place for secrets to surface. She joined the procession, her small frame lost among the taller figures. The gardens were a labyrinth of hedges and rose beds, their shadows deepened by the flickering lanterns. She kept Clara in her sights, noting how the young woman lagged behind, her steps hesitant. Suddenly, Clara veered off the main path, heading toward a secluded gazebo. Miss Marple followed, her heart quickening. The gazebo was shrouded in ivy, its interior barely visible. As she drew closer, she heard voices, Clara's, trembling with anger, and Harrow's low and urgent. "You can't keep pushing me." Clara hissed. "I didn't sign up for this. Thomas doesn't know. And if he, keep your voice down." Harrow snapped. "The auction is tomorrow night. The locket's already in London. You play your part, and your family's debts are cleared. Cross me, and you'll regret it." Miss Marple's breath caught. Tomorrow night. The auction's date was the missing piece she needed. But before she could retreat, a twig snapped under her foot. The voices stopped, and Harrow's silhouette appeared at the gazebo's entrance. "Who's there?" he called, his voice sharp. Miss Marple froze, her mind racing. She stepped forward, adopting her most disarming smile. "Oh, goodness, I do apologize. I seem to have wandered off the path. These old eyes, you know." She waved her fan vaguely, praying her mask concealed her intent. Harrow steadied her, his eyes narrowing. Clara, pale and wide-eyed, said nothing. After a tense moment, Harrow nodded curtly. "The procession's that way, madam. Best not linger." "Thank you, dear," Miss Marple said, her voice syrupy. She turned and shuffled back toward the lanterns, her heart pounding, but her expression serene. She'd heard enough. The auction was set. The locket was in London, and Clara was caught in a web not entirely of her own making. As the fireworks burst overhead, painting the sky in bursts of crimson and gold, Miss Marple slipped away from the manor, her mind alight with plans. The masquerade had revealed more than she'd hoped, and tomorrow's auction would be her next move. She would need a disguise, a plan, and perhaps a touch of daring, but Miss Jane Marple was no stranger to any of those. The night air was cool as she stepped into the waiting car, the manor's lights fading behind her. The web of deceit was unraveling thread by thread, and she was determined to see it through to its end. Chapter 6. The midnight auction. Moon hung low over St. Mary Mead, its pale light filtering through the gnarled branches of ancient oaks, casting long, wavering shadows across the cobblestone path. Miss Jane Marple, clad in a nondescript black shawl and a borrowed velvet cloak, moved silently through the night. Her steps were deliberate, her small frame blending into the darkness as she approached the old mill. On the outskirts of the village, the mill, long abandoned, was rumored to house secrets. Tonight an illicit auction where the stolen Ashby family heirloom, a sapphire-encrusted locket, was to be sold to the highest bidder. Miss Marple's heart beat steadily, though her mind raced. She had pieced together enough from her visit to Mr. Harrow's antiques shop to know this was no ordinary sale. The locket, a seemingly sentimental trinket, was rumored to hold the key to a hidden fortune map, perhaps, or a cipher etched into its intricate filigree. Her discovery of Clara's brother, Thomas, entangled in this web, had only sharpened her resolve. Tonight, she would infiltrate the auction, not as the unassuming spinster of St. Mary Mead, but as Mrs. Evelyn Carter, a wealthy widow with a penchant for rare antiquities. The mill loomed ahead, its weathered timbers groaning faintly in the wind. A faint glow spilled from the cracks in its boarded-up windows, and the low hum of voices carried on the breeze. Miss Marple adjusted the veil pinned to her borrowed hat, its delicate knitting obscuring her features just enough to pass muster. She had borrowed the hat and cloak from Mrs. Price, the village gossip, who had been all too eager to lend them when Miss Marple spun a vague tale of a charity costume event. The disguise was simple, but effective. Her usual tweed and sensible shoes replaced by a flowing skirt and a touch of rouge, enough to transform her into someone who might plausibly bid on stolen goods. She approached the heavy oak door, where a burly man with a scar across his cheek stood guard. His eyes narrowed as she presented a forged invitation, crafted with the help of young Tommy Price, Mrs. Price's grandson, who had a knack for calligraphy. The guard squinted at the paper, then at her, his gaze lingering on the veil. Miss Marple met his stare with a serene smile, her voice soft but firm. "Mrs. Evelyn Carter, I believe I'm expected." The guard grunted, stepping aside. "Don't cause trouble, lady, keep to the rules." Inside, the mill's interior was a stark contrast to its dilapidated exterior. The vast, open space had been transformed into a clandestine auction house. Oil lamps hung from the rafters, casting a warm, flickering glow over rows of velvet-draped chairs. A dozen or so bidders, their faces partially obscured by masks or hoods, murmured among themselves. The air was thick with the scent of wax and old wood, mingled with a faint trace of expensive perfume and cigar smoke. At the far end, a makeshift platform held a table draped in crimson cloth, where Mr. Harrow, the shady antiques dealer, stood adjusting his spectacles. Beside him, a locked glass case glinted under the lamplight, and within it, Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the unmistakable gleam of the sapphire locket. She took a seat near the back, her posture demure but her senses alert. The other bidders were a motley crew, some clearly wealthy, their tailored coats and glittering cufflinks betraying their status, while others had the rough edges of opportunists or mercenaries. One man, his face hidden by a domino mask, kept glancing toward the door, his fingers drumming nervously on his knee. Another, a woman in a peacock blue gown, clutched a fan with a grip that suggested more than casual interest in the proceedings. Miss Marple noted them all, her mind cataloging their tics and gestures as if they were characters in one of her beloved novels. The auction began with a sharp rap of Mr. Harrow's gavel. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice oily and precise, "tonight, we offer rarities of unparalleled value. Discretion is paramount. Let us begin." The first few items were mundane enough. A jade figurine, a set of silver candlesticks, a gilded pocket watch. Miss Marple bid sparingly, raising her paddle just enough to maintain her cover. Her eyes, however, never strayed far from the glass case. She noticed Mr. Harrow's assistant, a weary young man with darting eyes, slipping in and out of a side door, carrying whispered messages to someone unseen. Her suspicions deepened. This was no simple black market sale. There was a hierarchy here, a shadow behind the operation. Then she saw him, Thomas, Clara's brother, slinking into the room. His lanky frame was unmistakable, though he wore a poorly fitting mask that did little to hide his nervous demeanor. He took a seat near the front, his hands fidgeting with a crumpled bidding paddle. Miss Marple's heart sank. Thomas, barely 20, had always struck her as a boy out of his depth, his bravado masking a deep-seated fear of failure. His presence here confirmed her worst fears. He was not just a thief, but a pawn in a larger game. The locket was brought forward at last. Mr. Harrow lifted the glass case with a flourish, holding the sapphire-encrusted piece aloft. "The Ashby locket," he announced, "a relic of unparalleled craftsmanship, rumored to conceal secrets worth more than gold. Bidding begins at £5,000. The room erupted in murmurs. Miss Marple leaned forward, her pulse quickening. £5,000 was a fortune, far beyond the locket's apparent value. The bidders, however, seemed undeterred. Paddles rose swiftly, the price climbing to 10,000. Then 15. Thomas raised his paddle once, then hesitated, his face pale. Miss Marple's mind raced. Who was funding him? And why was the locket so coveted? As the bidding reached 20,000, the woman in the peacock blue gown stood abruptly, her fan snapping shut. 30,000, she declared, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. The other bidders faltered, their murmurs turning to stunned silence. Mr. Harrow's smile widened. But Miss Marple caught a flicker of unease in his eyes. The woman's bid was reckless, almost theatrical, as if meant to draw attention. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden commotion at the side door. The weary assistant burst in, his face ashen. "Harrow," he hissed, loud enough for the room to hear. "We've got trouble constables spotted on the road." Panic rippled through the crowd. Bidders scrambled to their feet, some clutching their masks, others shoving toward the exits. Mr. Harrow slammed his gavel down, shouting for order, but the room was already descending into chaos. Miss Marple remained seated, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the frenzy around her. She had anticipated a disruption. Such affairs rarely went smoothly, but the timing was fortuitous. Her eyes darted to the platform, where the locket still lay momentarily unguarded. Then, without warning, the lamps flickered and died, plunging the mill into darkness. Shouts and footsteps echoed in the void, accompanied by the crash of overturned chairs. Miss Marple's hand closed around the small penknife she always carried in her reticule. Not for violence, but for moments like this, she moved swiftly, her steps light but purposeful, navigating the chaos by memory and instinct. The platform was only a few yards away, and she reached it just as the lamps flickered back to life. The glass case was open, the locket gone, but in the confusion, Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught a glint of paper beneath the crimson cloth. A single page, torn from a ledger, its edges singed as if someone had tried to destroy it. She slipped it into her reticule, her movements as deft as a pickpocket's. The weary assistant was shouting orders, but Mr. Harrow was nowhere to be seen. Neither was Thomas. The sound of hoofbeats outside signaled the constable's approach. Miss Marple knew she had moments to act. She slipped through the side door, the same one the assistant had used, and found herself in a narrow corridor lined with crates. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of mildew and something sharper gunpowder. Perhaps her suspicions about the mill deepened. This was no mere auction site. It was a hub for something far more dangerous. At the end of the corridor, a trapdoor led to a cellar. Miss Marple hesitated, her practicality warring with her curiosity. The ledger page was a prize, but the locket was still out there, and Thomas's fate was uncertain. She descended the creaking steps, her penknife at the ready. The cellar was dimly lit by a single lantern, revealing stacks of crates and a heavy iron safe. Footsteps above told her the constables had arrived, their shouts muffled but urgent. Then she saw him, Thomas, crouched behind a crate, clutching the locket. His mask was gone, his face streaked with sweat and fear. "Miss Marple," he whispered, his voice cracking. "What are you? No time, Thomas," she said softly, her tone calm but commanding. "Give me the locket and follow me." He hesitated, his eyes darting to the trapdoor. "They'll kill me," he muttered. "Grayson, he's not what he seems." Miss Marple's mind clicked. Grayson, the London banker she had yet to meet, was a name that had surfaced in whispers at the antique shop. Then constables were closing in, their lanterns casting wild shadows on the mill's stone walls. Miss Marple moved quickly, pulling Thomas toward a narrow window at the back of the cellar. "Out," she whispered, her voice steady despite the chaos. Now, they slipped through the window, emerging into the cool night air. The ledger page, safely tucked in her reticule, burned with potential. It was a piece of the puzzle, a clue to the web of deceit she was unraveling. Thomas clutched the locket, his hands trembling, but Miss Marple's focus was unshaken. She led him through the underbrush, her steps silent, her mind already turning to the next move. As they vanished into the shadows, the mill behind them erupted in shouts and the clatter of boots. The locket was secure, the ledger page a new lead, and Miss Marple's resolve was stronger than ever. The night had been a gamble, but she had emerged with more than she'd hoped, a step closer to the truth. Chapter 7. The ledger's hidden code. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cozy cottage in St. Mary Mead, the late afternoon sun filtering through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the worn oak table. A single page from the stolen ledger lay before her, its edges slightly crumpled from her daring escape from the midnight auction. The paper was heavy with secrets, its cryptic numbers and abbreviations a puzzle that beckoned her sharp mind. A cup of chamomile tea steamed beside her, untouched, as her eyes darted across the page. This was no ordinary ledger. It was a map to a network of deceit, and Miss Marple was determined to trace its paths. The room was quiet save for the soft ticking of the mantel clock and the occasional chirp of a sparrow outside. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles, her fingers brushing the paper as she murmured, "There's always a pattern, if one looks closely enough." She had seen enough of human nature to know that greed, like a poorly darned sock, always left loose threads. This ledger page was one such thread, and she intended to pull it until the entire web unraveled. The page was a dense grid of numbers, dates, and initials written in a meticulous hand. At first glance, it appeared to be a record of transactions, perhaps sales from Mr. Harrow's antiques shop. But the sums were too large, the dates too irregular, and the initials unfamiliar. CL, TF, GR, and others appeared repeatedly, paired with amounts that suggested something far grander than the sale of old vases or chipped teacups. Miss Marple's lips pursed. "A code," she said softly, "but not a clever one. People always think they're cleverer than they are." She rose, her movements deliberate, and retrieved a small notebook from her knitting bag. The bag, a faded floral affair, held more than wool and needles. It was a repository of her thoughts, filled with scribbled observations from garden parties, tea shops, and now a clandestine auction. She flipped to a fresh page and began jotting down the ledger's contents, her handwriting neat but unhurried. The key to a code, she knew, was context, and she had gathered enough of that to make a start. Clara Langley, the nervous young woman from the garden party, was at the heart of this. Her furtive glance, her whispered conversation about a debt, and her brother Thomas's presence at the auction pointed to a family entangled in something unsavory. The initials CL likely stood for Clara, and TF could be Thomas Langley. But GR, Miss Marple tapped her pencil against the table. The name Grayson flickered in her mind. A London banker, mentioned in passing by Mr. Harrow at the antiques shop. A man of wealth and influence, yet tied to a shady auction in a crumbling warehouse. Interesting, she murmured, circling the initials in her notebook. The ledger's numbers were another matter. They ranged from hundreds to tens of thousands of pounds, with dates stretching back a decade. Some entries were marked with a small asterisk, others with a slash. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Not sales," she said, "but payments or debts." The asterisks, she suspected, indicated completed transactions, while the slashes marked those still owed. If Clara's family was in financial ruin, as the tea shop whispers suggested, then Thomas's involvement in the auction might be an attempt to settle such a debt. But to whom? And for what? She turned her attention to a column labeled Ref. Each entry had a 4-digit code, like 2314 or 8902. At first, she thought they might be invoice numbers, but their irregularities, some repeating, others unique, suggested otherwise. She leaned back, her mind drifting to a conversation she'd once had with a retired cryptographer at a church bazaar. He'd spoken of substitution ciphers, where numbers stood for letters. Simple, but effective. He'd said, "If you don't overthink it." Miss Marple smiled faintly. She never overthought, but she always thought deeply. She opened her notebook to a fresh page and began mapping the numbers to the alphabet. If A was 1 and Z was 26, the 4-digit codes might represent pairs of letters. She tested the theory with 2,314. The number 23 corresponded to W and 14 to N. WN, not a word, but perhaps initials or a shorthand. She tried another, 8,900 to become I and B, IB. Again, no clear meaning, but a pattern was emerging. The codes were too consistent to be random. She needed more context, perhaps a name, a place, or a specific transaction. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Miss Marple glanced at the clock 4:30. She wasn't expecting visitors, and in St. Mary Mead, unannounced callers were rare. She tucked the ledger page beneath a cushion and smoothed her skirt before opening the door. Miss Marple. It was Mrs. Price, the village's most prolific gossip. Her cheeks flushed from the brisk walk. I hope I'm not disturbing you, but I simply had to tell you what I heard at the post office. Miss Marple ushered her in, her expression one of polite curiosity. Not at all, Mrs. Price. Would you like some tea? Oh, no, I shan't stay long, Mrs. Price said, though she settled comfortably into the armchair. It's about that Langley girl, Clara. Did you know she was seen in London last week? With a man, no less. A tall fellow, sharp suit, looked like he belonged in a bank, not a tea shop. Miss Marple's ears pricked up. A banker, you say? That's what Mrs. Collins said, and she's got an eye for details. Said he was older, maybe 40, with a scar on his left cheek. Clara looked ever so nervous. Poor thing. They were at that fancy cafe near Threadneedle Street. What's a village girl like Clara doing in the city with a man like that? Miss Marple's mind raced. Threadneedle Street was the heart of London's financial district, home to banks and brokers. A man with a scar could be Mr. Grayson, someone connected to him. How very curious, she said, her tone mild. Did Mrs. Collins hear anything else? Mrs. Price leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. She said Clara kept looking over her shoulder, like she was afraid of being followed. And the man handed her an envelope thick, like it was stuffed with papers. Or money. Miss Marple nodded, her face betraying nothing. Thank you, Mrs. Price. That's most illuminating. Mrs. Price beamed, pleased to have been of use, and soon bustled off to spread her news elsewhere. Miss Marple returned to the ledger page, her mind now buzzing with new possibilities. An envelope in London, a banker with a scar, and Clara's ferret all pointed to Mr. Grayson as the linchpin. But what was he buying or selling? That required such secrecy. She resumed her work on the code, now suspecting the 4-digit numbers might correspond to names or places in Grayson's network. She wrote out the alphabet again, this time considering a shift cipher, where each number was offset by a fixed amount. If the key was 3, then 23 became 20T and 14 became 11. K. TK's still not a word, but possibly another set of initials. She tested a few more codes, but the results were inconclusive. Patience, she told herself. The truth always reveals itself in time. As dusk settled over the village, Miss Marple lit a small lamp and turned her attention to the dates in the ledger. One entry, dated 3 months prior, caught her eye. GR to CL, 5,000, ref for 2,314. Asterisk. The asterisk suggested a completed transaction, and the amount was significant. If CL was Clara, then Grayson had paid her or her family a substantial sum. For the heirloom or something else. She recalled the vicar's tale of a stranger near the manor where the heirloom vanished. The description tall, sharp-suited, a scar matched Mrs. Price's gossip. Grayson had been in St. Mary Mead, perhaps to collect the heirloom himself. But why involve Clara and Thomas? Miss Marple's fingers drummed lightly on the table. A middleman, she said, or a scapegoat. The thought of Thomas Langley stirred something in her. His presence at the auction, bidding on the very heirloom stolen from his family, was too blatant to be accidental. Was he complicit or coerced? Miss Marple knew the young man's reputation charming but reckless, with a fondness for cards and horses. Gambling debts could drive a man to desperate acts, even against his own kin. She resolved to speak with him, but carefully. A direct approach might scare him off, and she needed answers, not flight. She stood and moved to her writing desk, where she penned a brief note. Dear Thomas, I should like to discuss a matter of mutual interest. Might you call at my cottage tomorrow at noon? Yours sincerely, J. Marple. She sealed the envelope and set it aside for the morning post. Confronting Thomas would be delicate, but Miss Marple had a gift for making people talk. A kind word, a gentle question, and most would spill their secrets without realizing it. The evening grew late, but Miss Marple was not ready to rest. She returned to the ledger, her eyes lingering on a final detail. A small symbol in the margin, a circle. With a cross inside, it appeared only once, next to an entry for GR and a sum of £20,000. She sketched the symbol in her notebook, her mind turning to old books on heraldry she'd read as a girl. The symbol resembled a merchant's mark, used to denote a specific trader or guild. Could it point to Grayson's true business or his partner? She leaned back, her thoughts drifting to the auction. The blackout had been no accident. Someone had wanted to disrupt the sale, perhaps to protect the heirloom or to steal it. Thomas's presence there suggested he knew more than he'd let on. And Clara's fear, her whispered debts, her meeting with a scarred banker, all of it wove together into a tapestry Miss Marple was beginning to understand. As the clock struck 10. She closed her notebook and placed the ledger page in a hidden compartment in her desk. Tomorrow, she would meet Thomas and test her suspicions. For now, she allowed herself a small sip of tea, now cold, and a quiet smile. The web of deceit was intricate, but not unbreakable. One look, one thread, one truth at a time. She would unravel it all. The next morning dawned crisp and bright. The village stirring with its usual rhythm of milk deliveries and children scampering to school. Miss Marple rose early, tending her roses before breakfast. The garden was her sanctuary, a place where she could think without interruption. She clipped a wilted bloom, her mind still on the ledger. The code was stubborn, but she felt closer to cracking it. The symbol, the initials, the dates, they were pieces of a puzzle. And Thomas Langley was the next piece to place. At noon, the doorbell chimed. Miss Marple opened it to find Thomas, his handsome face shadowed by unease. He was tall, with the lanky grace of youth, but his eyes darted nervously, and his hands fidgeted with the brim of his hat. Good day, Thomas, Miss Marple said warmly, gesturing to the sitting room. Do come in. I've just put the kettle on. Thank you, Miss Marple, he said, his voice tight. He sat stiffly on the edge of the sofa, his head now clutched in his lap. Your note was unexpected. I imagine so, she said, pouring tea. But I've always found a quiet chat can clear up all sorts of misunderstandings. Sugar? He shook his head, his fingers tightening around the hat. What's this about, Miss Marple? You said a matter of mutual interest. She smiled, her eyes kind but piercing. I've been hearing things, Thomas, about your family, about debts, about a certain heirloom. And then there's the matter of the auction. His face paled, and for a moment, she thought he might bolt. But he stayed, his jaw tightening. I don't know what you mean. Oh, I think you do, she said gently. I was there, you see, at the warehouse. I saw you bidding on a brooch that once belonged to your grandmother. A curious thing, don't you think, for a young man to bid on his own family's treasure? Thomas's mouth opened, then closed. He ran a hand through his hair, his composure fraying. It's not what you think, he said at last. I didn't steal it. I had to. Had to. Miss Marple tilted her head, her voice soft as a lullaby. Why don't you tell me, Thomas, from the beginning? He hesitated, his eyes searching hers for judgment. Finding none, he exhaled shakily. It's Grayson, the banker. He's got us, Clara, and me in a bind. Father left debts, more than we could ever pay. Grayson offered to clear them, but only if I got him the brooch. Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged. And so you took it. I didn't want to. He burst out. But he said he'd ruin us. Sell the house. Take everything. Clara doesn't know. She thinks I'm just, I don't know, sorting things out. I thought if I could get the brooch back at the auction, I could return it before anyone noticed. But someone did notice, Miss Marple said, and now the brooch is part of something much larger. Tell me about Grayson. What does he want with it? Thomas swallowed. He said it's a key to what? I don't know. Something about an estate, papers locked away. He's obsessed with it. Keeps talking about reclaiming what's his. Miss Marple's mind flashed to the ledger, the symbol, the £20,000 entry. An estate, forged documents, a network of deceit. It was all coming together. Thank you, Thomas, she said. You've been very helpful. He looked at her, his eyes pleading. What now? If Grayson finds out I talked, he won't, she said firmly. But you must trust me, and you must help me. There's more at stake here than your family's honor. Thomas nodded, his shoulders sagging with relief. What do you need me to do? Miss Marple smiled, her plan taking shape. For now, go home. Act as if nothing's changed. I'll call on you soon. As Thomas left, Miss Marple returned to her desk, her heart quickening. The ledger's code was no longer just numbers and letters. It was a trail to Grayson's empire. She would follow it to London, to his office, to the heart of his schemes. And she would bring Thomas with her, not as a suspect, but as an ally. The web of deceit was unraveling, and Miss Marple's one look had set it all in motion. Chapter 8. A brother's confession. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns across the polished oak table where she sat. Her knitting needles clicking softly, the air carried the faint scent of lavender from the garden, mingling with the steam rising from her teacup. She had spent the night poring over the ledger page she'd slipped from the midnight auction, its cryptic symbols now etched in her mind like the lines of a well-loved book. The code had yielded its secrets, a trail leading to a London banker named Mr. Grayson, whose name appeared repeatedly in connection to the illicit dealings surrounding the stolen heirloom. But the ledger alone wasn't enough to untangle this web. Miss Marple needed more than paper. She needed the truth from a living soul. And that soul, she decided, was Thomas, Clara's wayward brother. Miss Marple's sharp eyes flicked toward the window as she heard the crunch of gravel on the path. Thomas was early, his silhouette moving hesitantly toward her door. She set her knitting aside, smoothed her cardigan, and rose to greet him, her expression as serene as ever, but her mind racing with calculated questions. Thomas's involvement in the auction had been a shock, yet not entirely unexpected. Young men, she knew, often stumbled into trouble when desperation outpaced their judgment. But was Thomas a pawn or a player in this game of deceit? The knock came, soft and uncertain. Come in, Thomas, Miss Marple called, her voice warm but firm, like a schoolteacher addressing a tardy pupil. The door creaked open, and Thomas stepped inside, his broad shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. He was a tall, young man, no more than 25, with the same dark curls as his sister Clara, but none of her nervous energy. His eyes, red-rimmed and shadowed, avoided Miss Marple's as he stood awkwardly in the doorway, clutching a worn cap in his hands. "Good morning, Thomas," Miss Marple said, gesturing to a chair opposite her. "Do sit down. I've just put the kettle on. Would you care for tea?" "No, thank you, Miss Marple," he mumbled, his voice rough, as if he hadn't slept. He sat, his long legs folding awkwardly under the low chair, and twisted the cap in his hands. I got your note. You said you wanted to talk." "Yes," she replied, settling back into her seat with the grace of someone who knew exactly how to put others at ease, or on edge. "I've been thinking about you and Clara, and that rather unfortunate business with the heirloom. It's caused quite a stir, hasn't it?" Thomas's fingers tightened on the cap, his knuckles whitening. "I don't know what you mean," he said, too quickly. "Clara's got nothing to do with it." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes softening but never leaving his face. "Oh, I'm sure Clara's heart is in the right place. But you, Thomas, I saw you at the auction last night. Quite a bold move, bidding on an item that belongs to your own family." The color drained from Thomas's face, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from the water. You were there?" he stammered. "How a lady of my age learns to blend in," Miss Marple said with a small, knowing smile. "Now, Thomas, I'm not here to scold you like a naughty schoolboy, but I do need to understand why a young man with a good name would involve himself in such a shadowy affair. The heirloom, the auction, Mr. Grayson. It's all rather tangled, isn't it?" Thomas slumped forward, burying his face in his hands. For a moment, the only sound was the ticking of the mantel clock and the distant chirping of sparrows outside. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I swear it, Miss Marple. It was just... I had no choice." "No choice?" she prompted gently, her tone inviting rather than accusing. "Tell me, Thomas. I find that troubles, when shared, often seem less heavy." He looked up, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "It's the debts," he said, the words tumbling out like stones from a collapsing dam. "Gambling debts. I got in over my head at the card tables in London, stupid, reckless games with men who don't play fair. They kept raising the stakes, and I kept losing, thinking I could win it back. Before I knew it, I owed Mr. Grayson thousands." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly, but she said nothing, letting the silence draw him out. "He's not just a banker," Thomas continued, his voice growing bitter. "Grayson's got his fingers in everything: cards, loans, antiques, you name it. When I couldn't pay, he didn't come for my money. He wanted favors. Said he'd wipe the slate clean if I helped him with the heirloom." "The heirloom," Miss Marple repeated softly, her mind already connecting threads. "You mean the sapphire brooch, the one your great-aunt left to Clara?" Thomas nodded, his face crumpling with shame. "It was supposed to be Clara's inheritance, but I took it. Grayson told me exactly where it was kept, how to get it without being seen. He said it was just a trinket, that no one would miss it. But then I saw it at the auction, and I realized it's worth far more than he let on." Miss Marple leaned forward, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "And why, Thomas, did you bid on it? If you'd already given it to Grayson, why try to buy it back?" "Because I couldn't let it go," he said, his voice breaking. "Not after I saw Clara crying over it. She thinks it's her fault it's gone, that she lost it somehow. I thought if I could get it back, maybe I could make things right. But Grayson, he knew I'd try. He was watching me, making sure I played along. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, a flicker of indignation crossing her face. Played along? You mean he's manipulating you, Thomas, using your debts to keep you under his thumb? Thomas nodded miserably. He's got others, too. Families like ours, people who've fallen on hard times. He lends them money, then twists their arms to do his dirty work stealing, forging papers. Whatever he needs. He's got a whole network, Miss Marple. The auction was just the start. The room fell silent again, save for the faint clink of Miss Marple's teaspoon as she stirred her tea absently, her mind whirring. Grayson's operation was larger than she'd imagined. A spider's web stretching far beyond St. Mary Mead. The heirloom, it seemed, was not just a stolen trinket, but a piece in a much larger puzzle she intended to solve. Thomas, she said at last, her voice steady but kind, you've made mistakes. But you're not beyond redemption. You've told me the truth, and that's a start. Now, I need you to help me. If we're to stop Mr. Grayson, we need proof of his schemes. Do you know anything that might help us? Thomas hesitated, his fingers twisting the cap again. Then, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled envelope. This, he said, sliding it across the table. Grayson gave it to me last week. Said it was instructions for the next job. But I haven't opened it. I couldn't bring myself to keep going. Miss Marple took the envelope, her fingers brushing the coarse paper. It was sealed with a wax stamp, unmarked but for a faint smudge of ink. She didn't open it, not yet. Instead, she tucked it into her knitting basket, her movements deliberate. Thank you, Thomas, she said. This could be very helpful indeed. He looked at her, his eyes searching for something forgiveness, perhaps, or hope. What happens now? Miss Marple, will you tell the police about me? I mean, she smiled, a gentle, almost maternal smile. My dear boy, I'm not in the habit of handing young men over to the authorities without giving them a chance to make amends. You've taken a step toward that today. Help me bring Mr. Grayson to justice. And I dare say we can keep your name out of it. Thomas exhaled, a shudder of relief. I'll do whatever you need, he said, his voice stronger now. I want to make this right for Clara, for our family. Good, Miss Marple said, rising from her chair. Then we'll start with a little trip to London. I have a feeling Mr. Grayson's office holds more secrets than he'd like us to know. Meet me at the station tomorrow morning. 9 o'clock sharp. And Thomas, she added, her eyes twinkling with a hint of mischief, do try to get some rest. You'll need your wits about you. As Thomas left, his steps lighter than when he'd arrived, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her needles, resuming their rhythmic dance. But her mind was far from the soft wool in her hands. The envelope in her basket felt like a ticking bomb. Its contents unknown, but undoubtedly dangerous. Grayson's network, Thomas's debts, the heirlooms. Roll in a forged willet was all coming together, piece by piece, like one of her intricate lace patterns. She glanced at the clock. There was just enough time before supper to pay a visit to Mrs. Price, the village's most reliable source of gossip. If anyone knew more about Grayson's dealings or his ties to Lord Ashby's family, it would be her. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, slipped the envelope into her handbag, and stepped out into the golden afternoon, her mind alive with possibilities. The path to Mrs. Price's cottage wound through the village, past the churchyard where late summer roses bloomed in riotous color. Miss Marple walked slowly, her sensible shoes tapping lightly on the cobblestones, her eyes taking in every detail: the flutter of a curtain, the laughter of children playing by the green, the faint scent of wood smoke in the air. To an outsider, St. Mary Mead was a picture of tranquility. but Miss Marple knew better. Beneath its calm surface, secrets simmered, waiting for someone with the right touch to bring them to light. Mrs. Price was in her garden, clipping herbs with a pair of rusty shears, when Miss Marple arrived. "Why, Jane Marple," the older woman exclaimed, her round face breaking into a grin. "What brings you here? Not another of your little mysteries, I hope." "Oh, nothing so dramatic," Miss Marple said with a chuckle, though her eyes gleamed. "I was just wondering if you'd heard anything about that London banker, Mr. Grayson. He's been mentioned in connection with the Ashby family, and you know how curious I get about such things." Mrs. Price's eyes lit up, her shears forgotten. "Grayson, you say? Oh, there's a story there. Mark my words. My cousin's friend in London works as a typist. She says he's got a reputation for lending money to folk who can't pay it back. And there's talk of him being thick as thieves with Lord Ashby's late father, back when the manor was nearly sold off to cover debts. Mind you, that's just gossip." Miss Marple nodded, her face betraying nothing but polite interest. Gossip, she knew, was often the raw ore from which truth was mined. "How fascinating," she said. "And no one's ever mentioned a connection to, say, a certain sapphire brooch?" Mrs. Price's mouth formed a perfect "oh, the brooch, you. Don't think, oh, Jane, you are clever. I did hear something about a scandal years ago. Something about a will that wasn't quite right. But it's all hushed up now. You'd have to ask someone at the manor for the details." "I might just do that," Miss Marple said, her smile serene. "Thank you, Mrs. Price. You've been most helpful." As she walked back to her cottage, the envelope in her handbag seemed to grow heavier. Grayson's manipulation of Thomas, his ties to the Ashby family, the whispers of a forged willet all pointed to a scheme far grander than a single stolen heirloom. But Miss Marple was not one to rush. Each clue, each conversation was a stitch in the pattern, and she would not pull the final thread until the design was complete. That evening, as she sat by her fire with a cup of chamomile tea, Miss Marple opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, its edges frayed, covered in Grayson's precise handwriting. It listed names none she recognized immediately alongside sums of money, and cryptic phrases: Ashby Estate, final payment, safe deposit, London, will to be revised. At the bottom, in bold ink, was an address, 17 Harrow Lane, London. Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. Tomorrow, she and Thomas would pay Mr. Grayson a visit, and if her instincts were correct, that visit would unravel more than Grayson expected. She set the paper aside and picked up her knitting, her needles moving with quiet precision. The fire crackled, the clock ticked, and outside, the village slept under a blanket of stars. But Miss Marple's mind was far from restful. Grayson's web of deceit was vast, but she had found its center, and with one careful tug, she would bring it all tumbling down. Chapter 9. The banker's secret room. Fog clung to London's cobblestone streets like a conspirator, muffling the clatter of hooves and the distant chime of a church bell tolling midnight. Miss Jane Marple, her slight frame wrapped in a modest woolen coat, stood in the shadowed alley beside Grayson's imposing office building. Her eyes, sharp as a hawk's despite the dim gaslight, scanned the street for any sign of movement. Beside her, Thomas, Clara's wayward brother, shifted nervously, his breath forming faint clouds in the chill air. "Are you certain about this, Miss Marple?" Thomas whispered, his voice betraying a tremor. His face, usually flushed with the bravado of youth, was pale, the weight of his betrayal to his family etched in the lines around his eyes. "If Grayson catches us, then we mustn't be caught," Miss Marple replied crisply, her tone carrying the calm authority of a schoolmistress addressing a fretful pupil. She adjusted her hat, a practical affair with a single feather, and glanced at the heavy iron key in her gloved hand, a key Thomas had reluctantly procured from a disgruntled former clerk of Grayson's. Now, Thomas, chin up. We've a job to do, and it won't do to falter. The key had been their first stroke of luck. A small rebellion from a man who'd grown wary of Grayson's manipulations. Miss Marple had met the clerk, a weary fellow named Perkins, in a smoky pub 2 days prior, over a pint of bitter. He'd spilled tales of Grayson's secretive dealings, ledgers that never saw daylight, meetings held behind locked doors, and a room no one was permitted to enter. He's got something hidden, Perkins had muttered, sliding the key across the table. If you're fool enough to go looking, that's your funeral. Miss Marple was no fool, but she was curious, a curiosity that had unraveled many a knot in St. Mary Mead. The key, she suspected, would unlock more than a door. It would reveal the heart of Grayson's web of deceit. The banker's obsession with the stolen heirloom, a sapphire-encrusted locket from Clara's family, had led her here, to this looming brick edifice in the heart of London's financial district. The street was empty, save for a stray cat slinking along the gutter. Miss Marple nodded to Thomas, who, with a deep breath, stepped forward to the side in trance, a narrow door tucked beneath an iron grate. The key turned with a reluctant groan, and the door creaked open, revealing a dark corridor that smelled of damp stone and ink. Inside, the air was heavy, the silence broken only by the faint drip of a leak somewhere in the building's bowels. Miss Marple's small torch, a modern contraption she'd borrowed from her nephew Raymond, cast a feeble glow, illuminating walls lined with filing cabinets and shelves groaning under the weight of ledgers. Thomas's footsteps echoed too loudly, and she placed a gentle hand on his arm. Softly, dear, she murmured. We're not here to announce ourselves. They moved deeper into the office, past desks cluttered with papers and inkwells, until they reached a heavy oak door at the far end of the hall. A brass plate read private, and Miss Marple's lips pursed. This must be it, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The key fit the lock, but it resisted, as if reluctant to yield its secrets. Thomas leaned his weight against it, and with a muted click, the door swung inward. The room beyond was unlike the rest of the office. Where the outer chambers were utilitarian, this was a sanctum of opulence. Mahogany panels lined the walls, reflecting the torchlight in warm, polished gleams. A massive desk dominated the center, its surface bare save for a single crystal decanter and a leather-bound book. Shelves held rows of identical ledgers, their spines unmarked, and a Persian rug muffled their steps. But it was the far wall that drew Miss Marple's eye, a section of paneling slightly misaligned, as if it had been recently disturbed. Thomas, she said, pointing, that wall. It's not quite right, is it? He squinted, then nodded. Looks like it's been moved. A hidden door, maybe. Miss Marple approached, her fingers tracing the panel's edge. She pressed gently, and with a soft click, a section of the wall slid aside, revealing a narrow chamber. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of old paper and wax. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with documents, and a small safe set in the corner, its steel surface glinting ominously. Grayson's secrets, Miss Marple murmured, stepping inside. Let's see what he's been hiding. Thomas hesitated, glancing back at the open door. What if someone comes? Then we'll be quick, she replied, already scanning the shelves. Her fingers, nimble despite her age, plucked a bundle of papers tied with twine. She untied it, revealing a series of letters. Their ink faded, but legible. The first bore the crest of Lord Ashby's family, a detail that sent a spark of recognition through her. Thomas, look at this. Correspondence between Grayson and Lord Ashby's late father. Dated 20 years ago. Thomas peered over her shoulder, his brow furrowing. What's it say? She skimmed the text, her lips moving silently. It's about a will-contested one. Lord Ashby's father, it seems, left a substantial portion of his estate to a distant cousin, bypassing his son. Grayson was the executor, but these letters suggest he altered the terms. Forged it. Thomas's voice rose, and Miss Marple shot him a warning glance. Possibly, she said, folding the letter and tucking it into her handbag. But there's more here. Look at this. She pulled another document, a ledger page listing transactions large. Sums paid to an unnamed party, marked only with the initials CF. The dates aligned with the theft of the heirloom, and one entry caught her eye. Locket, sapphire. Delivered to CF for appraisal. CF? Thomas muttered. Clara's family? Could it be us? Miss Marple shook her head. No, dear. Clara's family is too poor to be receiving such sums. This is someone else, someone Grayson trusted with the locket. She paused, her mind racing. The heirloom, she'd learned at the auction, was more than a trinket. It was a key to a disputed estate. Its sapphire rumored to conceal a map to a hidden cache. Grayson's obsession with it wasn't mere greed, it was leverage. She moved to the safe, its dial gleaming under the torchlight. Thomas, have you ever picked a lock? His eyes widened. Me? No. I'm no thief, well, not that kind. She smiled faintly. No need for that. I suspect Grayson's arrogance will be his undoing. Men like him often use predictable combinations. She tested the dial, turning it slowly, listening for the faint clicks she'd once learned from a rather disreputable acquaintance in her youth. After a moment, it yielded with a satisfying clunk, revealing a small compartment stuffed with more papers and a single, glittering object. The sapphire locket. Miss Marple's breath caught, but before she could reach for it, a floorboard creaked in the outer office. Thomas froze, his face ashen. Someone's here, he hissed. Quiet, Miss Marple whispered, easing the safe shut. She grabbed the bundle of papers and the locket, slipping them into her handbag, and gestured for Thomas to follow her to the hidden door. They pressed themselves against the wall, the torch extinguished as footsteps approached, slow, deliberate, and heavy. The oak door creaked open, and a figure stepped into the room. Miss Marple peered through a crack in the panel, her heart steady despite the danger. It was Grayson himself, his gaunt face illuminated by a lantern. He wore a dressing gown, as if roused from bed, and his eyes darted about the room with a predator's intensity. He moved to the desk, muttering to himself, and opened the leather-bound book. He knows. Thomas breathed, so softly Miss Marple barely heard him. Not yet, she whispered back, but he will soon. Grayson's fingers paused on the book, and he turned sharply toward the hidden door. Miss Marple held her breath, her mind calculating their escape. The alley door was too far, and the main office would be locked. Their only chance was to wait, to hope Grayson's suspicion didn't lead him to the secret room. He stepped closer, his lantern casting wild shadows. Miss Marple's hand tightened on Thomas's arm, urging him to stay still. Grayson's fingers brushed the panel, and for a moment, it seemed he would find the latch. But then a shout came. From the street, a drunken reveler, perhaps, or a night watchman. Grayson cursed under his breath and turned away, striding out of the room with his lantern swinging. Now, Miss Marple said, pulling Thomas through the hidden door and back into the main office. They moved swiftly, retracing their steps through the darkened corridor. The side door was still ajar, and they slipped into the alley, the fog swallowing them as they fled. They didn't stop until they reached a quiet square, a few streets away, where Miss Marple leaned against a lamppost, catching her breath. Thomas, panting, stared at her with a mix of awe and terror. "You're mad, Miss Marple. Absolutely mad." She chuckled, patting her handbag. "Perhaps, dear. But we've got what we came for." Inside her bag, the locket gleamed faintly, its sapphire catching the lamplight. The papers, too, were a treasure trove proof of Grayson's fraud, his manipulation of the Ashby estate, and his connection to the mysterious CF. Miss Marple's mind was already piecing together the next steps: a return to St. Mary Mead, a conversation with Mrs. Price, and a closer look at the manor's secrets. Grayson's empire was crumbling, and she held the key to its collapse. As they disappeared into the fog, Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with quiet triumph. The web of deceit was unraveling, thread by thread, and she was one step closer to the truth. Chapter 10. The village gossip's clue. Morning sun spilled through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns across the polished oak floor. She sat in her favorite armchair, a cup of Darjeeling tea steaming gently. In her hands, her knitting needles resting idly on the side table. Her mind, however, was far from idle. The events of the past week Clara's anxious glances, the coded ledger, the secret auction, and the incriminating documents found in Mr. Grayson's hidden rooms whirled in her thoughts like leaves caught in an autumn gust. Each clue had led her closer to the heart of the mystery. But one piece remained elusive, the final link that would unravel the full scope of Grayson's deceit. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window, where her garden bloomed with late summer roses. She recalled the fleeting mention of a scandal tied to Lord Ashby's late father, a detail Thomas had let slip during his tearful confession. It was a thread worth tugging. And in St. Mary Mead, no one was better equipped to unearth old scandals than Mrs. Florence Price, the village's most prolific gossip. With a decisive nod, Miss Marple set her teacup down and reached for her shawl. A visit to Mrs. Price was in order. The walk to Mrs. Price's modest cottage on the edge of the village was pleasant, the air crisp with the promise of autumn. Miss Marple moved with her usual unhurried grace, her eyes sharp as they scanned the familiar lanes. Children played near the bakery, their laughter mingling with the scent of fresh bread. A delivery boy on a bicycle nearly collided with old Mr. Timmins, who shook his fist good-naturedly to an outsider. St. Mary Mead was a picture of serene simplicity, but Miss Marple knew better. Beneath its tranquil surface, the village hummed with secrets, and Mrs. Price was its unofficial archivist. Mrs. Price's cottage was a riot of color, its garden overflowing with dahlias and marigolds. The woman herself was at the gate, pruning, shears in hand, her round face flushed from exertion. She wore a garish floral dress that clashed spectacularly with the blooms around her, and her eyes lit up at the sight of Miss Marple. "Why, Jane Marple," Mrs. Price exclaimed, waving her shears with a flourish. "What brings you out this fine morning? Not just a social call, I'll wager." Miss Marple smiled, her expression as mild as ever. "Oh, Florence, you know me too well. I was hoping for a chat over a cup of tea, if you've a moment. There's something on my mind, and I thought you might shed some light." Mrs. Price's eyes gleamed with the prospect of sharing her vast repository of village lore. Come in. I've just put the kettle on, and I've a fresh batch of scones. Mind you, they're not as good as Mrs. Baker's, but they'll do." Inside, the cottage was as cluttered as its garden, every surface adorned with knickknacks and framed photographs. Miss Marple settled into a chintz-covered chair, accepting a cup of tea and a scone with polite enthusiasm. Mrs. Price bustled about, her chatter filling the room like a cheerful brook. "Now, Jane," she said, settling across from Miss Marple with a conspiratorial lean. "What's this about? You've got that look in your eye, the one that means you're sniffing out something juicy." Miss Marple chuckled softly. You're too perceptive, Florence. It's nothing so dramatic. I assure you. I was merely thinking about old stories. The kind that linger in a village like ours. I recall you mentioning something years ago about Lord Ashby's father, the late Lord Reginald. A bit of a scandal, wasn't it? Mrs. Price's face lit up like a beacon. Oh, Jane, you've hit on a good one. The old Lord Reginald Ashby. Now there was a tale. Mind you, it was before your time in St. Mary Mead, but the village never forgets. Let me see, she tapped her chin, her eyes distant as she sifted through decades of gossip. It was the summer of 92, or was it 93? No matter. Lord Reginald was a charming man, handsome as the devil, but he had a weakness for cards and a worse one for bad company. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression attentive but unhurried. Bad company, you say? Oh, yes. Mrs. Price leaned forward, her voice dropping to a dramatic whisper. There was this fellow, a banker from London, who came down to the manor for a shooting weekend. Grayson, his name was Cedric Grayson. That's it. A slick sort. All smiles and fancy suits. But the maids said he had a way of looking at you that made your skin crawl. Anyway, the story goes that Grayson and Lord Reginald got up to some shady business. Something about a will, or maybe a deed, that went missing after one of their late-night card games. Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly on her teacup, but her face remained serene. A missing will? That's intriguing. Do you recall any details? Mrs. Price frowned, her brow furrowing as she dug deeper into her memory. Well, it was all hushed up, of course. The Ashby family didn't want their name dragged through the mud. But I heard from Mrs. Carter, who worked at the manor back then, that Lord Reginald was in a terrible state afterward. Pale as a ghost, she said, and he locked himself in his study for days. There was talk of a safe, some old family strongbox, that held papers proving the Ashby estate wasn't rightfully theirs. Can you imagine? The whole manor snatched out from under them. Miss Marple's mind raced, though her expression betrayed nothing. A safe, papers, a disputed estate. It dovetailed neatly with the documents she and Thomas had found in Grayson's hidden room. Papers that hinted at a forged will tied to the Ashby fortune. Could this be the key to Grayson's obsession with the stolen heirloom? And if so, what role did Lord Ashby, the current lord, play in it all? That's most helpful, Florence, Miss Marple said, setting her teacup down. You've a remarkable memory for these things. Was there ever any proof about this safe or its contents? Mrs. Price shook her head, her curls bouncing. Not that I know of. The scandal fizzled out when Lord Reginald died heart attack. They said, though some whispered it was shame, the safe was never found, or so the maids claimed. But if you ask me, Jane, those old manor houses are full of secrets. Hidden rooms, secret passages. Why? I wouldn't be surprised if that safe is still there, tucked away behind a bookcase or under a floorboard. Miss Marple smiled, her mind already mapping out the next step. You're quite right, Florence. Old houses do keep their secrets. I mustn't take up more of your time, but I'm grateful for the chat. Oh, nonsense. Mrs. Price waved a hand. You're welcome anytime, Jane. And if you hear anything more about that old scandal, you let me know. I'd love to have a new tidbit to share at the Women's Institute. As Miss Marple made her way back to her cottage, her steps were brisk despite her age. The safe. It was a tantalizing lead, one that could tie together the threads of Grayson's scheme and the Ashby family's involvement. If the safe existed and held proof of a forged will, it would explain why Grayson was so desperate to control the heirloom sapphire brooch. Thomas had confessed. That was rumored to be a key to unlocking a family secret. Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile. How like a village rumor to hold a kernel of truth. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled at her writing desk, pulling out a small notebook where she jotted down her thoughts. The documents from Grayson's office had mentioned a key to the Ashby legacy, and now Mrs. Price's story suggested a physical safe. The brooch, with its intricate design, might indeed be more than a jewel, perhaps a literal key, or a marker to the safe's location. But Ashby Manor was vast, its history layered with renovations and secrets. Finding a hidden safe would require more than guesswork. She considered her options. Returning to the manor openly would arouse suspicion, especially after her presence at the masquerade ball. Lord Ashby, though charming, had struck her as guarded, his smiles too polished to be genuine. And Grayson, now aware that his office had been breached, would be on high alert. No, she needed and ally someone with access to the manor and a reason to be there without drawing attention. Thomas. The thought came unbidden, but it felt right. Clara's brother, racked with guilt over his betrayal, had pledged to help Miss Marple make amends. He knew the manor well, having grown up in its shadow as part of the village's gentry. If anyone could navigate its halls discreetly, it was him. But could she trust him fully? His confession had been heartfelt, but desperation had driven him to steal once before. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. People, she knew, were capable of surprising reversals, but they were also predictable in their patterns. Thomas's pattern was one of loyalty twisted by circumstance. With the right guidance, he could be her key to the manor. She penned a note to Thomas, her handwriting neat and precise. Dear Thomas, I hope this finds you well. I have need of your assistance in a matter concerning the manor. Could you meet me at the churchyard tomorrow at noon? It is a delicate affair, but one I believe will bring clarity to recent events. Discretion, as always, is paramount. Yours sincerely, Jane Marple. Sealed the note and arranged for it to be delivered by the postmistress's son, a reliable lad who asked no questions. With that done, Miss Marple turned her attention to the manor's layout, sketching a rough map from memory. The masquerade ball had given her a glimpse of its grand halls and winding corridors. But a hidden safe would likely be in a private space, Lord Ashby's study, perhaps, or an older wing, untouched by modern renovations. The next day, Miss Marple arrived at the churchyard promptly at noon, her straw hat tilted against the sun. The ancient yew trees cast long shadows over the gravestones, and the air was heavy with the scent of cut grass. Thomas was already there, pacing near the light gate, his face pale and drawn. He wore a simple tweed jacket, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, and his eyes darted nervously as Miss Marple approached. Miss Marple, he said, his voice low. I got your note. I wasn't sure you'd want to see me again, after everything. Nonsense, Thomas, she replied, her tone gentle but firm. You've made mistakes, but you're here now, and that's what matters. I need your help to find something at Ashby Manor, a safe, possibly hidden, that may hold papers tied to this whole affair. Thomas's eyes widened. A safe in the manor? I've never heard of such a thing. But, well, the place is old. Father used to say there were rooms even he didn't know about. What kind of papers? Miss Marple hesitated, weighing how much to reveal. Papers that might prove Mr. Grayson's actions were not just about your family's heirloom, but something much larger. A will, perhaps, or a deed that affects the Ashby estate. If we can find them, we can stop Grayson for good. Thomas swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. I'll help you, Miss Marple. I owe Clara that much and you, for giving me a chance to make things right. But the manor's not easy to get into. Lord Ashby's been jumpy since the ball, and there are servants everywhere. Miss Marple nodded, her mind already working through the problem. Then we'll need a pretext. Something that allows us to move freely without raising suspicion. Tell me, Thomas, does the manor still host those charity teas for the village? Thomas blinked, caught off guard. Yes, every month. There's one tomorrow, actually. Clara was supposed to help organize it, but she's been too shaken up. Perfect, Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. You'll offer to take Clara's place, citing her indisposition. I'll accompany you as a volunteer. No one questions an old lady lending a hand for charity. We'll use the opportunity to slip away and search the manor. Thomas looked dubious, but nodded. If you think it'll work, I trust you. Where do we start looking? The study, I think, Miss Marple said. Or perhaps the old library. Hidden safes are often tucked behind bookshelves or false panels. We'll need to be quick and quiet. The plan said they parted ways, Thomas's. Steps lighter than when he'd arrived. Miss Marple returned home, her mind buzzing with possibilities. The charity tea would provide cover, but the real challenge lay in navigating the manor's secrets without alerting Lord Ashby or his staff. She spent the evening reviewing her notes, her fingers tracing the sketch of the manor's layout. The study was on the second floor, overlooking the rose garden, but the library was in the older west wing, a maze of narrow passages and faded grandeur. Either could hold the safe, but her instincts leaned toward the library. It was less frequented, a relic of the manor's past, and thus a perfect hiding place. The next morning, Miss Marple dressed carefully, choosing a simple gray dress and a modest hat that made her look every inch the unassuming spinster. She arrived at Ashby Manor with Thomas, who carried a basket of homemade jam tarts as their contribution to the tea. The manor's lawns were bustling with villagers, their chatter mingling with the clink of teacups and the soft strains of a string quartet. Lord Ashby himself made a brief appearance, his smile as polished as ever. But Miss Marple noticed the tension in his posture, the way his eyes scanned the crowd. Stay close, she murmured to Thomas as they set up a table near the terrace. And keep an eye on Lord Ashby. If he leaves, we'll need to move quickly. The tea was a success, with villagers milling about, praising the scones and gossiping about the weather. Miss Marple played her part perfectly, pouring tea and exchanging pleasantries, all while watching the manor's entrances. When Lord Ashby excused himself to take a telephone call, she nudged Thomas. Now, she said softly, the library. Follow me. They slipped through a side door, moving swiftly through the manor's cool, shadowed halls. The library was at the end of a long corridor, its heavy oak doors slightly ajar. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old leather and dust. Shelves towered to the ceiling, crammed with books that looked untouched for decades. A massive fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel carved with the Ashby crest. Where do we start? Thomas whispered, his voice tight with nerves. Miss Marple's eyes swept the room. Lingering on the fireplace, there, she said, pointing to a panel beside it. The carving looks uneven, as if it's been tampered with. Try pressing it. Thomas hesitated, then stepped forward, his fingers brushing the panel. With a soft click, it sprang open, revealing a small, rusted safe embedded in the wall. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but before she could speak, footsteps echoed in the corridor. Hide, she hissed, pulling Thomas behind a heavy curtain. They held their breath as a maid entered, carrying a duster. She glanced around, then left, muttering about the dust. Miss Marple waited a moment before stepping out. Quickly, she said, kneeling before the safe. It was old, its lock simple but sturdy. The sapphire brooch, she realized, might indeed be a key. Its intricate clasp could fit the lock's unusual shape. But the brooch was still in Grayson's possession, locked away in his London office. "We'll need to come back," she said, her voice calm despite the setback. "But we've found it. Thomas, the safe is real, and it holds the answers we need." They slipped back to the tea, rejoining the crowd just as Lord Ashby returned. Miss Marple poured another cup of tea, her face serene, but her mind was alight with plans. The safe was the key, and she would find a way to open it without the brooch, if necessary. As she handed a cup to a grateful villager, her eyes met Thomas's, and she gave a slight nod. The web of deceit was unraveling, and she was one step closer to its heart. Chapter 11. The safe's dark sackcloth moon hung low over Ashby Manor, its pale light filtering through the ancient oaks that lined the estate's gravel drive. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and late summer roses, and a faint mist curled around the manor's ivy-clad walls, giving it the look of a sleeping giant. Miss Jane Marple moved silently along the edge of the lawn, her sensible shoes barely whispering against the grass. Beside her, Thomas Dunhill, Clara's younger brother, kept pace, his breath uneven, his eyes darting to every shadow. The weight of their mission pressed upon them both, to find the hidden safe in Lord Ashby's study, and uncover the proof that would unravel the web of deceit spun by the London banker, Mr. Grayson. Miss Marple had not anticipated returning to Ashby Manor so soon after the masquerade ball, where she had overheard Clara's heated exchange with the shady antiques dealer, Mr. Harrow. But the ledger page she had slipped from the midnight auction had led her here, its cryptic entries pointing to a forged will and a safe hidden within the manor's walls. The letters inside, she suspected, would confirm Grayson's fraud and perhaps reveal the true extent of his hold over Clara's family. Thomas, still raw with guilt over stealing the family heirloom to settle his gambling debts, had agreed to help, his resolve a fragile thread in the tapestry of Miss Marple's plan. The manor loomed before them, its windows dark save for a single flicker of candlelight in an upper room. Miss Marple paused behind a gnarled yew tree, her shawl blending into the night. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice calm but firm, "you must stay steady. We're not here to take anything that isn't ours. We're here for the truth." Thomas nodded, his jaw tight. "I know, Miss Marple. I owe Clara this. I owe her everything." His voice cracked, betraying the weight of his betrayal. At 22, he was boyish still, with a mop of auburn hair like his sister's and eyes that carried too much regret for one so young. Miss Marple's heart softened, but her gaze remained sharp. Pity was no use without action, and tonight required precision. They had chosen this hour past midnight, when the household was likely asleep, based on a tidbit from Mrs. Price, the village gossip, who had mentioned Lord Ashby's habit of retiring early after a glass of port. The servants, too, would be in their quarters, save perhaps for a night footman. But Miss Marple had accounted for that. She had brought a small vial of chamomile tea, laced with just enough lavender to soothe a weary guard into a doze should the need arise. For now, though, the night was theirs, the side entrance, a narrow door used by the kitchen staff. Was there a way in? Thomas had scouted it earlier, noting its rusty lock and loose hinge details Miss Marple had praised as most observant. He knelt now, working a hairpin she had provided into the lock, his fingers trembling but deft. "You've done this before," Miss Marple remarked, not accusingly, but with a faint twinkle in her eye. Thomas flushed. "Not exactly, ma'am. Just practiced on the stables when I was a lad. Got me out of a few scrapes." The lock clicked, and the door creaked open, revealing a dim corridor smelling of polish and old stone. Miss Marple stepped inside, her movements as sure as if she were strolling to the village shop. Thomas followed, closing the door behind them. The manor was silent, save for the distant tick of a grandfather clock and the faint rustle of their own steps. On the runner carpet, the study, according to Mrs. Price's chatter, was on the ground floor, tucked behind the grand staircase. They moved through the kitchen, past gleaming copper pots and a table strewn with the remnants of a late supper crumbs of bread, a half-eaten apple. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the apple, its core browned but not yet shriveled. Someone had been here recently, she noted, and not a servant. Servants didn't leave half-eaten fruit on the table. They reached the study door, its heavy oak carved with vines and roses, a relic of the manor's prouder days. Thomas hesitated, his hand on the knob. "What if it's locked?" he whispered. "Then we'll find another way," Miss Marple replied, her voice a quiet anchor. "But let's try first." The door was unlocked, swinging inward with a soft groan. The study was a cavern of shadows, its walls lined with bookshelves that stretched to the ceiling. A massive desk dominated the center, littered with papers, an inkwell, and a brass candelabrum unlit, but gleaming in the moonlight that spilled through a tall window. Miss Marple's gaze swept the room, settling on a portrait above the fireplace, Lord Ashby's father, his stern face framed by a powdered wig, his eyes seeming to follow them. "The safe," she murmured, recalling Mrs. Price's tale of a hidden compartment behind a painting. "It's likely there." Thomas crossed to the fireplace, his steps tentative, and ran his fingers along the portrait's gilded frame. "How do we?" he began, but a faint click interrupted him. The frame shifted, revealing a small brass dial embedded in the wall. Miss Marple joined him, her eyes narrowing as she studied the safe. It was a modern design, not the clunky iron boxes of her youth, with a combination lock that gleamed faintly in the dark. "Do you know how to open it?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a breath. Miss Marple's lips twitched. "I'm no safe cracker, Thomas, but I've seen enough to know these things often rely on human nature. People choose combinations that mean something: birthdays, anniversaries, numbers they can't forget." She stepped closer, her fingers brushing the dial. "Lord Ashby's father died in 1892, didn't he? And his son, the current lord, was born in 1885, I believe." Mrs. Bantry mentioned it once, over tea. "Let's try the 5th of August, 18. Thomas stared, incredulous. "You remember that?" "I remember many things," Miss Marple said simply, turning the dial with steady hands. "Left to 18, right to 8, left again to 5. A soft click echoed in the silence, and the safe door swung open. Inside was a small compartment, no larger than a bread box, containing a bundle of letters tied with a black ribbon, a leather-bound journal, and a single pearl earring that caught the moonlight like a teardrop. Miss Marple reached for the letters, her fingers careful, as if handling a relic. She untied the ribbon and scanned the first page, her eyes moving quickly over the elegant script. It was a letter from Lord Ashby's father to Mr. Grayson, dated 20 years prior, detailing an agreement to alter a will in exchange for a substantial sum. The words were careful, couched in euphemisms, but their meaning was clear: fraud, deliberate and cold. "This is it," Miss Marple said softly. "Proof of Grayson's scheme. The will was forged to cut out a rightful heir, likely Clara's family, given the heirloom's significance." Thomas leaned over her shoulder, his breath catching. "Clara didn't know," he said, almost to himself. "She thought I stole the necklace for my debts, but it was more than that. Grayson wanted it because it tied the Dunhills to the estate." Miss Marple nodded, slipping the letters into her shawl. "The necklace was a symbol, a key to the claim. Your family's ruin was his gain." She reached for the journal, flipping through its pages. It was a ledger of sorts, listing payments to Grayson, each entry initialed by Lord Ashby's father. The final page held a single line, scrawled in a different hand. "The truth lies with the pearl." Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the earring, its solitary gleam a puzzle yet to be solved. Before she could speak, a sharp creak split the silence of floorboard. Not far off, Thomas froze, his eyes wide. Miss Marple's hand closed around the earring, slipping it into her pocket as she gestured for silence. The creak came again, closer now, accompanied by the soft shuffle of footsteps. Someone was in the corridor. Under the desk, Miss Marple whispered, her voice calm but urgent. Thomas scrambled beneath the massive oak, his lanky frame barely fitting. Miss Marple followed, her small size an advantage as she tucked herself into the shadows, her shawl blending with the gloom. The study door opened, and a figure stepped inside, silhouetted against the moonlight. It was not Lord Ashby, nor a servant, but a woman tall, her hair pinned in a severe bun, her movements deliberate. She carried a small lantern, its light casting jagged shadows across the bookshelves. Miss Marple squinted, recognizing the sharp profile of Mrs. Harrow, the antiques dealer's wife, whom she had seen only briefly at the auction. What was she doing here, in the dead of night? Mrs. Harrow moved to the desk, her lantern illuminating the scattered papers. She rifled through them, her fingers quick and practiced, muttering under her breath. "Where is it? He said it would be here." Miss Marple's mind raced. Mrs. Harrow's presence was no coincidence. Was she Grayson's agent, sent to retrieve the letters? Or was she after something else, the earring, perhaps, or the journal? The woman's muttering grew sharper, tinged with frustration. As she opened drawers and shoved papers aside, Thomas shifted beside Miss Marple, his knee brushing hers, and she placed a steadying hand on his arm. Patience, she thought. Let her. Show her hand. Mrs. Harrow paused, her lantern light falling on the portrait above the fireplace. She stepped closer, her fingers tracing the frame as Thomas had done. But before she could touch the dial, another sound broke the silence, a sharp rap at the window. Mrs. Harrow spun, her lantern wobbling, and Miss Marple caught a glimpse of her face, pale, sharp, her eyes wide with alarm. The rap came again, insistent. Mrs. Harrow hesitated, then hurried to the window, pulling back the heavy curtain. A man's face pressed against the glass. Mr. Harrow, his expression taut with urgency. "They're coming," he hissed, his voice muffled but clear. "We have to go now." Mrs. Harrow cursed under her breath, a word Miss Marple found surprisingly unladylike, and darted for the door, her lantern swinging wildly. The study fell dark again as she fled, her footsteps fading down the corridor. Miss Marple waited, counting to 10, then crawled from under the desk, her joints protesting, but her resolve firm. "Thomas," she said, helping him to his feet. "We must leave, quickly." He nodded, still shaken, clutching the journal she handed him. They slipped out of the study, retracing their steps through the kitchen and out the side door. The night air was cool against their faces, the mist thicker now, cloaking their escape. They moved swiftly across the lawn, the manor receding behind them like a dream dissolving at dawn. Back in the safety of Miss Marple's cottage, the fire crackling low, she spread the letters on her table, the pearl earring glinting beside them. Thomas sat across from her, his hands wrapped around a cup of tea she had insisted he drink. "Who was that woman?" he asked, his voice steadier now. "And what did her husband mean?" "They're coming." Miss Marple's eyes were on the letters, but her mind was elsewhere, piecing together the night's events. "Mrs. Harrow is no mere bystander," she said. "She and her husband are tied to Grayson, perhaps as deeply as Lord Ashby. As for their coming, it could be the authorities." Or someone else Grayson fears. We've stirred the nest, Thomas, and the wasps are buzzing. She picked up the earring, turning it in the firelight. The truth lies with the pearl, she murmured, echoing the journal's cryptic note. This earring is no trinket. It's a clue, perhaps to the rightful heir to something Grayson and his allies are desperate to hide. Thomas leaned forward, his guilt giving way to determination. What do we do now? Miss Marple smiled, a quiet, steely glint in her eye. We keep the letters safe and the earrings safer. Tomorrow, I'll speak with Mrs. Bantry. She knows more about the Ashby family than she realizes. And you, Thomas, must stay close to Clara. She's innocent in this, but she's not safe. Not yet. As Thomas nodded, the firelight casting shadows across his young face, Miss Marple felt the weight of the night's triumph. They had the letters, proof of Grayson's fraud, and the earring, a key to a deeper truth. The web of deceit was unraveling, thread by thread, and she would pull until it lay bare. For now, though, she sipped her tea, the cottage warm around her, and let the pieces settle. The safe's dark secret was hers, and it was only the beginning.